Chapter 1939. In the blink of an eye, within the power of the tribulation, the fragments of the world that were rushing towards this part of the world abruptly drew a mysterious arc in the void. At the critical moment, they actually penetrated Luo Fan's defensive layer in a seemingly simple but actually exquisite way, and brazenly attacked this part of the world. Or, to be more specific, it was heading for Luo Fan, who had just appeared in front of this world. Luo Fan was secretly horrified by this oncoming terror. The law power in his body trembled and started to erupt. Endless power was released in an instant and rushed towards the world fragment that was coming for him. During this process, this power kept changing the surrounding space-time, the surrounding nomological laws, and even the power of the tribulation. The ultimate goal of all these changes was to shatter the world fragment. That's right, to shatter the world fragment once again. Originally, it would have been the easiest and simplest method to shift the heaven and earth fragment to another direction that would not affect him and would not harm him. But obviously, this wasn't his target at this moment. This was because the most important thing for him now was to stop the plan of the will of heaven and earth. The will of heaven and earth absorbing the power of the tribulation that was contained in the world fragment was its plan. Luo Fan's magical power of laws was infinitely profound and powerful. Through the external environment, it naturally evolved all kinds of corresponding characteristics, turning into endless brilliance, forming endless images, and pouncing towards the fragment of heaven and earth. Under the control of the will of heaven and earth, the world fragment also underwent countless changes. As it changed, it erupted with a shocking power that collided with the power derived from Luo Fan's law of dermic power. In an instant, the world changed color. Even the power of the tribulation created a huge ripple at this moment. It started to spread in all directions. The power of the tribulation could even give birth to such a perfect world and give birth to another existence like Luo Fan. Its profoundness was self-evident. Right now, the ripples produced by such power would naturally not be like the ripples produced on the surface of a calm lake, which would only spread out in circles and disappear. In that instant, countless existences were born within the power of the tribulation. These existences came in all shapes and sizes. Some of them looked extremely ferocious. Some were completely useless. At least, they were completely useless in battle. All of this blended together, accompanied by ripples, constantly spreading in all directions. At first glance, it seemed as if a new world had been created. At this moment, Luo Fan felt an indescribably terrifying power pouring into his body through his law power, starting to detonate from the inside out. Even if his body had reached an incredible level of toughness under the support of the condensed worldview of laws, it still couldn't help him. In the face of such an earth-shattering explosion, it still seemed so fragile. In the blink of an eye, his body exploded and turned into a puff of thick smoke that rapidly churned on the spot. It was as if he was trying his best to reform, but he couldn't return to his original appearance no matter how hard he tried. However, compared to Luo Fan's powerful injuries, the fragment of heaven and earth didn't fare much better. At this moment, it had completely shattered and turned into smoke. Along with the ripples of the power of the tribulation, it began to disintegrate and spread in all directions. The power of the tribulation itself was an extremely high-end and powerful force. Such power naturally wasn't like the calm lake water that could be devoured at will. Previously, the fragment of heaven and earth could devour the power of the tribulation. That was because the fragment of heaven and earth itself was powerful enough to completely devour the power of the tribulation. But the situation now was obviously completely different. Now, the fragment of heaven and earth had been further shattered as it collided with the power derived from Luo Fan's law power. Now, the size of each fragment was less than a millionth of its original size. Naturally, its power had weakened to less than a millionth of its original size. With such a change, the suppressive force that it originally possessed was naturally gone. Without the suppressive force, the dominant and passive forces were completely reversed. The one that had the upper hand was the power of the tribulation. Therefore, the fragment of heaven and earth was devoured by the power of the tribulation instead. At this moment, the will of heaven and earth only said indifferently, "You can block it once, but can you block it 100 times?" At this moment, the pulling force that erupted from the vortex suddenly increased by several times. As it increased, Luo Fan felt that the fragment of heaven and earth that was coming from the depths of the power of the tribulation had accelerated once again. "How can I let you get what you want?" the smoke that Luo Fan had turned into said. Following that, the power of the infinite laws began to emanate from the smoke and quickly condensed the smoke into a human figure. A living Luo Fan, who didn't look any different from the original, came out. For Luo Fan, who had the concept of immortality, the explosion of his body was only a small problem. It didn't affect him much at all. He could recover at any time if he wanted to. At this moment, the huge vortex shook and Luo Fan suddenly felt the laws around his body start to change. An indescribable repulsion was produced from the laws and acted on his body, pushing him into the power of the tribulation. At this moment, Luo Fan snorted coldly. "Don't forget, I was the one who modified this world." Following this voice, the rules and laws that came into contact with him began to change rapidly. Suddenly, they completely betrayed the will of the world and transformed into a completely different form of existence. It was as if they had extended out from the world view of the world. During this transformation, the repulsion produced by the laws around him naturally disappeared completely. On the contrary, it turned into another inexplicable sound, just like his tentacles. It began to spread in all directions and gradually began to affect the surrounding heaven and earth, causing the surrounding heaven and earth to gradually turn into an existence similar to his domain. Instead, it began to reject the will of heaven and earth. Hee. Zhang Xian chuckled. A chuckle sounded from the vortex. Immediately after, the countless laws began to tremble violently. Amidst this trembling, Luo Fan felt a powerful force continuously transmitted to his heart, constantly impacting his body and his power. It was impacting his law power. In a trance, he felt as if his body was about to break free from his control. The body and the will were two existences that affected each other. When the will was stronger than the body's instincts, the will would naturally control the body. However, at a certain moment when the body's instincts were strengthened to an unimaginable level, the body's instincts would in turn affect the will and control it. In the end, the will would act according to the body's instincts. Now, as the creator of this world, Luo Fan's relationship with this world was equivalent to the will of the body. In contrast, the original will of this world was like the instinct of this world. Just now, Luo Fan relied on the power of his will to manipulate the laws of this world. Time and space were reconstructed according to his will, which was equivalent to the will controlling the body. However, at this moment, when the body's instincts were stimulated to the extreme, which meant that the will of heaven and earth continued to increase its power and strengthen its control over heaven and earth. It was equivalent to the body's instincts gradually suppressing his will. In this way, the situation would naturally be reversed, and the will would be affected by the body's instincts instead. Luo Fan's thoughts raced, and in the blink of an eye, he had already figured out this problem. His expression changed, and with a soft shout, he brazenly cut off his connection with this world. As he cut off this connection, the feeling that his body was gradually getting out of control and was about to completely lose control naturally dissipated. However, the repulsive force produced by the laws also returned naturally, constantly acting on his body, oppressing him, and impacting him. It took him a lot of effort to stabilize his body. Just as he was competing with the will of heaven and earth for the authority to control the laws, the hundreds of fragments of heaven and earth that were rushing straight towards him had already pounced on him. Even though Luo Fan's reaction speed was fast and his response was extremely accurate, he only had time to condense thousands of worlds of laws in front of him to resist the impact of the fragments of heaven and earth before he was hit by the fragments of heaven and earth. His entire body flew backwards like a meteor. During this process, endless power rushed into his body, constantly destroying everything in his body. Even his concept of existence was within the scope of that destruction. In the face of such a terrifying upheaval, how could Luo Fan have the time to pay attention to anything else? At this moment, he could only wholeheartedly expel the destructive power that was pouring into his body, work hard to maintain his body's integrity, and support his concept of existence. At this moment, the will of heaven and earth no longer seemed to be in the mood to care about him. The huge vortex that appeared in the center of heaven and earth began to spin frantically. Countless fragments of heaven and earth collided into it, and were continuously minced and devoured by the vortex. Every time a fragment of heaven and earth was minced and devoured, the vortex seemed to become much deeper, and the speed of its rotation also seemed to slightly accelerate. The entire world began to churn rapidly due to this change, and the traces that Luo Fan had left in this world began to be gradually expelled and eliminated during this process. Although this change was intense, it was on a much higher level than all the living beings except for Luo Fan. At this moment, in the face of such a change, none of the living beings could sense it. For the living beings, apart from the vortex in the sky that was constantly changing, there were no other changes in this part of the world. Everything was so natural. While the world was changing, all the living beings in it were also changing at the same time. This was like a person on a fast-moving train, and it was difficult to notice that the train was moving just by looking inside. Without Luo Fan to obstruct it, more and more fragments of heaven and earth appeared. The power of the tribulation carried with it an endless amount of tribulation power that constantly rushed into the world and was minced up by the vortex formed by the will of heaven and earth. It kept absorbing. In this way, from the outside world, it looked like the power of the tribulation had suddenly formed a tornado that continuously poured into this part of the world, causing this part of the world to continuously expand. It looked like a balloon being blown up. At this moment, Luo Fan had already been blasted into the ground by the collision of heaven and earth. He kept drilling into the depths of the ground, causing the ground to churn and his body to explode from the inside out. The scene was so tragic that no one could bear to see it. However, all this on the surface was nothing to him. The most important thing to him now was that he was suffering an endless blow on a conceptual level. In other words, his concept of survival was under attack. This kind of attack could cause absolute damage to any existence with the undying attribute. It was the same for him. If I can't block it, I will die. At this moment, Luo Fan had an unprecedented strong premonition. He had encountered attacks that involved the concept of existence many times in his countless battles. However, what he had experienced in the past, none of the attacks that involved concepts had been as direct and intense as this one. None of them had been. It had given him such a strong sense of crisis. At this moment, all the changes in the outside world had completely disappeared from his senses. They could no longer leave any traces in his heart. His mind had already entered the conceptual level, and he saw the various concepts that couldn't be described with words. In this concept, his concept of existence occupied the center, like a dot of green in a field of flowers. However, at this moment, this dot of green was swaying in the endless surrounding concepts. It was like a candle in a storm that could be extinguished at any time. Around this concept of existence, endless concepts were like landslides and tsunamis, madly pouncing on his concept of existence. They wanted to assimilate and destroy his concept of existence. My concept of existence is so weak. At this moment, this thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind. In fact, his concept of existence wasn't too weak in absolute terms. It could even be said that it was strong enough that it couldn't be shaken by ordinary cultivators. However, compared to his physical body, to his life essence, to his strength, to his cultivation realm, the concept of existence was too different. In Luo Fan's perception, his concept of existence could at most barely be considered to be compatible with the cultivation realm of a false saint. It was really a world of difference from his current realm. Perhaps this will be another opportunity for me. In an instant, this ridiculous thought appeared in his mind. Then, he smiled bitterly and dispelled this thought. From a certain point of view, this encounter was indeed a kind of opportunity for him. After all, it was usually very difficult for him to eliminate all other influences to directly see this concept of existence. Only at this moment, when his concept of existence itself was in a huge crisis, would his potential erupt, allowing him to surpass the boundaries and see the conceptual level that was originally invisible. This gave him a chance to operate, giving him a chance to strengthen his concept of existence and make up for the weakness that he couldn't make up for. However, obviously, the basis of all this was that he could ensure that his concept of existence wouldn't disappear in this kind of crisis. If even the concept of existence itself had disappeared, then even if this was a good opportunity, even if this opportunity could bring him many benefits, so what? If even the concept of existence was gone, there would no longer be any traces of his existence in the hearts of all living beings in this world. At that time, even the living beings themselves wouldn't feel anything, and their memories of Luo Fan would completely disappear. In that case, even if this opportunity was strong enough to let him become a true saint, so what? At this time, Luo Fan focused all of his mind, all of his energy, and all of his willpower on his concept of existence. He tried his best to strengthen his concept of existence to resist the impact of the countless concepts around him. This resistance was unimaginably painful. If an ordinary cultivator came to this level, enduring any moment would be enough to break through the limit of their pain tolerance and make their soul collapse. They wouldn't even need the concept of existence to be destroyed before they would die. Even for Luo Fan, this kind of pain was not easy to bear. In this instant, his thinking ability seemed to have suffered a destructive blow. Unknowingly, he had already become muddle-headed, and even the thought of relieving the pain could not be borne. Chapter 1940. Just as the concept of Luo Fan's existence was gradually submerged and eliminated, everyone who remembered Luo Fan's memories of Luo Fan were gradually fading, regardless of which world they were in or which period of time they were in. Even the Sky Maiden, who was cultivating in the innate inextinguishable spiritual light, was the same. Moreover, all of this happened silently. Even the Sky Maiden, who was cultivating, didn't notice the change at all. Facing such a tragic situation, Luo Fan didn't feel anything at all. He didn't even realize it. For him, trying his best to maintain the concept of his existence had already exhausted all his willpower and perception. His perception of time had already disappeared at some point in time. While his concept of existence was constantly being attacked and weakened, his perception of other concepts was also constantly strengthening. All concepts outside of himself were unprecedentedly strengthened in his perception. He had never sensed the existence of other concepts as clearly as he did now. Everything was like a brand new world to him. A brand new but deadly world. For him, this world was hovering between life and death. Every moment, he crossed the line of life and death and tried his best to struggle back. However, each time, the strength of his struggle became weaker and weaker. Each time he struggled back, it became more and more difficult in a daze. He didn't know how much time had passed. It seemed like hundreds of millions of years, but it also seemed like only an instant. On the conceptual level, his concept of existence had already been reduced to a state where it was faintly discernible. His mind sank deeper and deeper. His perception of the concept of the outside world had become so clear that it had even replaced his own concept of existence. However, his perception of his own concept of existence had also reached the edge of being completely cut off. He had achieved it. It was even weaker than the last bit of clarity in his mind. Under such circumstances, his life was in danger of truly dying out. At this moment, his last bit of potential was finally aroused. In that boundless pain and limitless drowsiness, he reignited the last bit of clarity. What came with this clarity was the view of the world that he had long since turned into a deep-rooted understanding of. In that instant, the remnants of his mind completely eliminated all unimportant thoughts. Only his understanding of the world and his perception of the concept remained. The reason why he retained his worldview was that this worldview had long become his most fundamental existence and had become a completely inseparable part of him. As for the conceptual level, it was needless to say. This was the level he was in right now, the source of his life and death crisis, and also the key to his rebirth. How could it not be left behind? Concept, worldview. In an instant, Luo Fan suddenly realized how much time he had wasted. In fact, the solution to his current life and death crisis was very simple, and that was to strengthen his own concept of existence. This point. From the very beginning, Luo Fan was clear about it. But, all along, he didn't even think of how to strengthen it. It wasn't until now that he had eliminated all other thoughts, leaving only the world view and the fire of induction at the level of the concept car, that he suddenly came to a realization. Wasn't the best way to strengthen his own concept of existence to integrate his own worldview into it? Luo Fan established a unique worldview that belonged entirely to himself. From the very beginning, it was to allow himself to resist the state of chaos, to allow himself to be eroded and assimilated by the terrifying state of chaos. He could still continue to exist, although it wasn't a direct target. But the fundamental goal was obviously this concept of existence. In that case, now that his concept of existence was too weak, it didn't match his true strength. Then, wasn't the only correct way to directly add the world view of laws to it? Thinking of this, Luo Fan didn't dare to stay any longer. With a slight movement in his heart, his world view began to constantly transcend and improve, quickly approaching the conceptual level. The conceptual level itself was an extremely high level. Even for Luo Fan, if he didn't encounter a direct impact on the conceptual level and didn't feel a huge threat to his concept of existence, it was very likely that he would be damaged and die. Even he wouldn't be able to advance to this conceptual level at this time. Therefore, for him, wanting to raise his world view of laws to this conceptual level and let it directly add to his own concept of existence was extremely difficult. It was as difficult as ordinary people trying to reach the sky in one step. However, for him now, no matter how difficult it was, this was already his last hope. Therefore, even if he felt extremely huge resistance, even if he felt that achieving his goal was so illusory, he still didn't feel discouraged and continued to move forward towards this goal, doing everything he could to achieve that goal. Even if the entire process seemed to be a futile effort, it was still the case, in fact. Even if it seemed like he was doing useless work to add the world view of laws to the concept of existence, in fact, on another level, he had already achieved great success. That was the existence of his concept of existence. The most obvious manifestation of this was that his concept of existence had stopped diminishing and weakening. In a way, his life and death crisis could be considered to have been temporarily resolved. However, at this time, Luo Fan didn't care about this at all. At this time, he had already put all his attention on raising the world view level to add to his concept of existence. Only by focusing all his attention on it would he be able to obtain such benefits and stop the weakening of his concept of existence. Otherwise, if he were to make even the slightest mistake, his progress would naturally be lost, and his concept of existence would definitely weaken once again in a trance. Time gradually passed. At least, it was the time that belonged to Luo Fan himself. Time gradually began to pass. 1 day, 2 days, 1 year, 2 years, 10 years, 100 years, 1,000 years, 10,000 years, 100,000 years, 100,000 years, 1,000,000 years, 10,000,000 years, 100,000,000 years, 1,000,000,000 years, 10,000,000,000 years, 1,000,000,000,000 years. Although he had the special ability to equate an instant with 1,000,000,000,000 years, that special ability was only complete in his mind. Only when his will was complete could it be effective. And now it was obvious. He was only left with the perception of the concept level and the understanding of the world view. Putting aside the fact that his spirit and will were complete, it was doubtful whether they even existed or not. How could someone like him equate 100 trillion years with an instant? Therefore, during this period of time, the time that belonged to him, every minute and second passed. It was completely reflected on his body, reflected in the essence of his life. Under such circumstances, even if he didn't have a complete will or perfect thinking ability, he gradually developed an inexplicable sense of vicissitude. During this process, Luo Fan's desire to survive that surpassed everything was displayed incisively and vividly. Trillions of years, time passed one after another, but his mind never wavered because of the passage of time. He never had the thought of retreating because he couldn't see any progress. After who knew how many trillions of years, his concept of existence finally faintly carried a hint of the charm of the world view. Although it was only a trace of charm, it was already a qualitative improvement. Its existence instantly caused Luo Fan's concept of existence to suddenly emit a sense of stability that was unique to it. With the appearance of this sense of stability, the concept of existence finally reversed development for the first time since Luo Fan stepped into this concept level. It changed from the original dim to bright again. With this change in trend, more senses appeared in Luo Fan's mind. With the appearance of the senses, his reason and his thinking ability recovered a little bit. He instinctively knew that he was walking on the right path. At that moment, he restrained his mind and continued to focus on the original continuous work of adding the world view to his concept of existence. With the first taste, the difficulty of his concept of existence being added to the world view had been reduced by one level. Next, in the span of 1,000,000,000 years, he once again allowed his concept of existence to be added. The feeling of the world view that was revealed in the concept of existence began to improve a little bit. The chain reaction brought about by this was that his concept of existence was once again lit up a little. His mind, his ability to think, once again recovered a little bit. Luo Fan, who instinctively discovered that this was effective, naturally didn't hesitate. He once again poured everything he had into it. Just like that, 1 trillion years passed, 2 trillion years passed, 10 trillion years passed. Finally, after an unknown number of trillions of years, at a certain moment, he made up for the last bit that was blocking his complete thinking and complete consciousness. Finally, after sinking into this concept level for an unknown number of trillions of years, he regained his consciousness for the first time. At this moment, Luo Fan's complete consciousness exhaled a long breath, and an inexplicable joy surged from the bottom of his heart. This is the true performance of the third great calamity. Such a thought emerged. Every time he faced a great tribulation, it was a struggle between life and death, a struggle to climb out of death. Ever since he encountered the third tribulation, although he was constantly facing danger, those dangers were still within his bearable range. It was so much so that he only needed to scheme a little before he could successfully get through it. Compared to the previous 2 great tribulations, where he narrowly escaped death each time, the difference was really too great. It wasn't until this time, when the concept of his own existence was greatly impacted and could collapse and disappear at any time, that he once again found the feeling of passing through the 2 great tribulations. This was not something to be happy about. In fact, it could even be said to be something that could make one despair. However, the appearance of this situation dispelled the last bit of worry in his heart. It dispelled the anxiety that he originally had about what would happen next in the third great trial. From this point of view, for him, this could be considered as a joyous occasion. As his thoughts spun, he began to focus his attention on this conceptual level. In this plane, his concept of existence, his appearance had completely changed. Now, this concept of existence had turned into a sphere surrounded by a halo. Just like his worldview, endless light was released from the center of the conceptual level, illuminating the entire conceptual level and affecting all the concepts in this conceptual level. The entire sphere with a halo was none other than the appearance of the worldview that he had already condensed, combined with the incomparably strong charm of the worldview that was revealed on it. At first glance, it was as if he was looking at a completely different view of the world. I finally barely managed to do it. Looking at the changes in the concept of existence, and feeling the sense of stability that came from the bottom of his heart, Luo Fan let out a long sigh. Although it was still not perfect, now his concept of existence could be considered to be in line with his realm. His weaknesses could also be considered to have been preliminarily made up for. His thoughts turned, and his senses spread out in other directions on this conceptual level. Soon, he noticed an extremely special concept in the distance. This concept was extremely huge. If Luo Fan's concept of existence was said to be just a small ping-pong ball, then that concept would be as big as the Earth. Its enormity was self-evident. After discovering this special concept, Luo Fan completely understood what he had encountered before. The infinite impact and endless crushing of the concept of existence that the paper had endured for at least 1 trillion years came from that huge concept. So that's it. No wonder the impact was so unbearable. Sighing in his heart, Luo Fan suddenly controlled his own concept of existence. Very slowly it moved towards the huge concept. Although that special concept was unimaginably huge, it was impossible to imagine. But just by looking at it now, one could tell that its strength was far inferior to Luo Fan's concept of existence at this time. Under such circumstances, if the two collided, as long as the method was correct, then Luo Fan's concept of existence would definitely win. And now, what Luo Fan had to do was to make his concept of existence win. The reason why he made this decision was very simple. Because when he saw this huge concept, he already knew what it was. After all, at the bottom of it all the attacks he'd suffered during the Third Great Tribulation had come from the Third Great Tribulation, and the impact and crushing of the concepts he had encountered before was the source of this huge concept in front of him. In this way, it was obvious that the concept in front of him was the concept of the Third Great Tribulation. In fact, it was very likely that it was the concept of the Third Great Tribulation. In this case, as long as he could shatter this huge concept and completely eliminate it, the Third Great Tribulation would completely dissipate, and he would be able to easily pass through the subsequent changes of the tribulations. Unfortunately, Luo Fan's realm was still not high enough to step into the concept level. At this time, even if he sensed this level through the sense of crisis, he still couldn't control his concept of existence at will. Therefore, although his will was extremely strong and he had already done his best to control his concept of existence, the movement speed of his concept of existence was still extremely slow. Just looking at the speed, although it was slightly faster than when he used the worldview of laws to enhance his concept of existence, it wasn't much faster. After roughly measuring the distance between the two concepts, Luo Fan found that it would take at least tens of billions of years for his concept of existence to reach the huge concept that was likely to be the concept of the Third Great Tribulation. Although it's a little long, it's still acceptable. After making a rough calculation, Luo Fan smiled faintly and accepted it without the slightest complaint. Now, his thoughts and will were absolutely complete, and the special ability to equate an instant with 100 trillion years had reappeared in him. In this way, tens of billions of years were equivalent to tens of thousands of instant for him. It wasn't even a breath, so what was the big deal? Moreover, apart from the fact that time was nothing, he could also rely on this period of time to work hard to enhance his worldview of laws on his concept of existence, so that his concept of existence could become stronger and more powerful before the two concepts collided. The entire concept level seemed to only have his own consciousness. Although the entire concept level was colorful, unpredictable, and extremely lively, he didn't sense the existence of any intelligence. Even if he released his perception to the limit, all he sensed were very ordinary concepts. This was very likely to cause the only existence of loneliness. But obviously, this situation couldn't happen to Luo Fan, who could even ignore time and carry out the equivalent. To him, this extremely lonely conceptual plane was simply like a boundless treasure vault, and there were boundless resources and treasures waiting for him to obtain and excavate. As time passed and he continued to move forward, his understanding of the concept of existence continued to deepen. Chapter 1941. Hundreds of billions of years passed in the blink of an eye. Unknowingly, Luo Fan had already pushed his own concept of existence and arrived at the place where the huge concept was located. In other words, after spending enough time to make almost all other cultivators despair, he had finally achieved his goal. After experiencing this long journey, Luo Fan's comprehension of the concept had unknowingly reached a certain extreme. At a glance, although the entire concept was still the same as before, it had completely changed in his eyes. From the original mystery, it had turned into all kinds of information that he could understand. It was as if it had changed from chaos to a normal world, a normal space-time, hundreds of billions of years. How long was this time? If ordinary creatures were to imagine it, just counting it would be enough to make their hair turn white. Such a long time was used to comprehend the entire concept. Even if the concept was profound, unfathomable, and extraordinary, he would inevitably have his own understanding of it. He would definitely have his own understanding of every concept in the entire concept. This kind of understanding might not necessarily be correct, but it was enough to make the concept in his eyes undergo an earth-shattering change. In this way, the most obvious change was that he could now enter and exit this concept at will. In other words, if he wanted to, he could directly leave this conceptual level, and in the next instant, he could easily step into this conceptual level based on his own thoughts. This kind of improvement could almost be said to be a qualitative improvement. In this way, it was enough to make him almost an invincible existence in front of all existences that couldn't reach the concept. By relying on his understanding of concepts over the past 10 trillion years, he had gained a great deal of experience. He had already determined that the huge concept in front of him was the concept of the existence of the third great calamity. No matter what it was in the calamity, even if it was the will of the world, and even if it was the other Luo Fan, their existences belonged to this huge concept in front of him. In other words, as long as he destroyed this huge concept, then everything in the third great calamity would completely disappear. Even the memories in the hearts of all living beings would completely disappear. As for it itself, it was not born of the Great Tribulation. However, it was affected by the Great Calamity and devoured by it, turning into a will of the world that could resist Luo Fan's methods. Although its concept of existence was not the same as the concept of existence of the third great calamity. However, the instant it was controlled by the tribulation, its own existence had already been absorbed into the third tribulation. Therefore, once the concept of the great calamity's existence disappeared, the concept of its own existence would no longer exist. However, from Luo Fan's point of view, Luo Fan's eyes were filled with disdain. He had been stuck in that conceptual level for countless trillions of years. But in reality, his own time was completely separated from the time in the outside world. In other words, for that part of the world in the great calamity, it was not a small world. For the will of heaven and earth, the flow of time was completely unrelated to the flow of time that Luo Fan had experienced. In reality, at this moment, only a few tens of thousands of years had passed in that world. The will of heaven and earth had not even completely absorbed all the fragments of the world in the other world. At this moment, that region of the world had completely changed. The original prosperity had completely disappeared. What replaced it was desolation and desolation. It was as if all the vitality in this world had been used up. This scene. Over the years, every time the fragments of the world plunged into the world, it caused the entire world to shake violently. It caused the laws of the world to undergo some kind of change, big or small, so that all living beings had no time to adapt to it. If it was in the past, when the will of heaven and earth wholeheartedly wanted to protect this world, it would naturally use all kinds of methods to help stabilize the laws of the world. This would give all living beings more time to adapt to the changes in the laws of the world and evolve to become stronger. But now, it was clear that the will of heaven and earth, which was wholeheartedly focused on absorbing the power of the tribulations and finally transcending the tribulations, did not have the mood to care about the living beings in this world. All its thoughts and will were focused on continuously drawing in the fragments of the world to absorb more of the power of the tribulations. If not for that, how could it not have the mood to care about Luo Fan after falling into the depths of this world for so long? It was precisely because of this that the current situation was created. In just a few tens of thousands of years, this world had already turned into this barren state. But on this day, an indescribable sense of danger suddenly surged in the will of heaven and earth's senses. The will of heaven and earth's way of thinking was completely different from living beings. Normally speaking, living beings could not understand its existence at all. However, the will of heaven and earth in front of it was different from all other wills of heaven and earth. It had experienced falling time and time again, becoming a will of heaven and earth again and again, being lifted up and pulled back to the level of the will of heaven and earth. Now, it was working hard to absorb the endless power of the tribulations for its own transcendence and its own freedom. In this state, its way of thinking already carried the characteristics of many living beings. Only in this way would it be afraid of its disappearance like living beings, and pursue its own transcendence like living beings. Under such circumstances, when it sensed this sudden sense of danger, its reaction was rather similar to that of a living creature. It stopped absorbing the fragments of the world, and began to thoroughly investigate everything that it could sense. Thoroughly investigated everything that could possibly cause it to have this kind of feeling. The will of heaven and earth was, after all, the will of heaven and earth. Soon, it had locked its target on Luo Fan, who had completely disappeared from its will for tens of thousands of years. Rumble voices of questioning echoed between the heavens and the earth. The loud rumbling sound penetrated the ground, penetrated the rules and laws, and blasted where Luo Fan was, who seemed to have turned into a fossil. This sound was, after all, the voice of the will of heaven and earth. Among them, naturally, it contained unimaginably terrifying power. Under the transmission of this power, Luo Fan, who seemed to have turned into a fossil, trembled slightly, and countless cracks appeared on its surface. The flesh inside was finally revealed again. As the flesh was revealed, a faintly discernible vitality seeped out. It was also at this moment that the will of heaven and earth discovered that Luo Fan, whom it thought was on the verge of death, still had such a strong vitality. How was this the appearance of someone on the verge of death? It could be said that he was in his peak condition. How is this possible? The rumbling voice contained such thoughts. Luo Fan did not die. That was to be expected. After all, the tribulation this time and the endless tribulation power in the surroundings existed because of Luo Fan's existence. If Luo Fan had died, then the tribulation would naturally disperse, and the power of the tribulation would naturally disappear. How could it continue to appear here? How could it continue to wait for it to continue absorbing? However, after suffering the direct impact of the tribulation power and being weakened to the limit, Luo Fan could continue to live. He should be constantly struggling on the edge of life and death, right? How could it be like this, with not much loss at all? At this moment, the will of heaven and earth finally became anxious. It did not seem to vent its anger. The laws of this world were already pushed by it. Endless power began to flow and circulate in this world in some indescribable way. In the sky, the huge vortex began to brew with endless sounds, and endless power surged. Suddenly, a boundless and terrifying power rushed straight down from the center of the vortex, and brazenly smashed down on Luo Fan. This terrifying power was the refinement of the tribulation power. Compared to the power of ordinary tribulations, it was millions of times stronger. As soon as this power appeared in this world, it had completely destroyed the spacetime within a range of billions of light years. Even the most basic and minute fragments could not be preserved. It was as if the spacetime within a radius of who knew how many billions of light years did not exist at all. Such terrifying might naturally surpass the power of time. It felt like the moment it appeared, or even before it appeared, it had already smashed into Luo Fan's body. Under this kind of terrifying power, Luo Fan's body didn't have any ability to resist. It collapsed with a loud bang, turning into countless fragments. Like billowing smoke, it began to roll in all directions. This fragility, this straightforwardness, made people almost unable to believe their eyes. It's that easy? The will of heaven and earth had indescribable doubts at this moment. However, it soon realized that it wasn't going to be that easy, because at this moment, the tribulation was still present, and the power of the tribulation was still surging in the surroundings, producing all sorts of terrifying noises and exploding earth-shattering might that surged in all directions. This situation clearly told it that the main body of the tribulation was still alive. The power of the tribulation was completely targeted at Luo Fan, so the power that it erupted was naturally the most destructive and terrifying power against him. Under such a bombardment, Luo Fan's death should have been the most complete, and he wouldn't have had any chance to resist at all. But now, it seemed like he had indeed died and disappeared. However, all external connections showed that he was still alive. This caused the will of heaven and earth to finally develop an incomprehensible emotion. The will of heaven and earth was extremely puzzled, but the tribulation itself wouldn't be like this. Its instinctive reaction caused its power to continuously spread and increase, gradually approaching the level of the concept. That's right, at this moment, everything that Luo Fan existed in the real world had indeed been completely erased by the power of the tribulation. However, his own concept of existence had only endured a small impact from the tribulation's concept of existence. In the past, such a small impact was indeed enough to completely shatter his concept of existence and make him lose all traces of his existence. However, that was only the past. For the current him, this kind of impact wasn't even enough to make him feel uncomfortable, as expected. The backlash is coming. This thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind as he felt the impact of the huge concept. Then, seizing the opportunity, he displayed all kinds of concept-related techniques that he had comprehended in the past billions of years, allowing his own concept of existence to cut into the huge concept with a method that was billions of times more precise than a scalpel. All kinds of mysterious quakes erupted in his concept of existence, causing cracks and fragments to appear in the huge concept in the process. As a result, the huge concept kept splattering everywhere. When such changes were reflected in the real world, they caused the power of the tribulation to continuously dissipate, causing the power of the tribulation to gradually weaken. However, because it was a change on the level of concept, even the will of heaven and earth couldn't detect this at all. Although it vaguely felt that something was happening, it vaguely discovered that it seemed to have overlooked some important information, but it couldn't find out what it was no matter how hard it tried. It only knew that the crisis of its life and death was getting closer and closer. This situation made the will of heaven and earth, which had some characteristics of a living being's will, begin to fear and become irritated. At this time, its emotions went berserk, causing the entire world to become more and more chaotic. Boundless chaotic energy swept and swept through the entire world. It was as if it was plowing the ground, stirring up the world over and over again countless times. After this stirring up, the damage to Luo Fan's body. Naturally, it didn't happen at all. Instead, it caused this world to become chaotic, as if it had returned to a state of chaos. Although this world was barren and broken back then, there were still bits and pieces of vitality. However, one could still see bits and pieces of vitality. One could still see that it was once a place with infinite vitality. If this world had a prosperous history, then now all of it had completely disappeared. No matter which level this world went into, there was no longer any trace of the existence of any living beings. Not to mention the various natural sceneries, even the heavens and the earth were changing and changing at any moment. The tribulations themselves were existences that possessed powerful instincts. In fact, once one's strength reached the level of innate Grand Luo, one would naturally develop their own intelligence and transform into a different kind of living being if there were no restrictions placed upon them. The might of this tribulation was countless trillions of times more formidable than the natural immortal realm. Even though it was still restricted by the chaotic state, merely the various things outside of the restrictions were sufficient to allow it to develop sufficient intelligence and possess sufficiently formidable instincts. Such intelligence was close to the intelligence of the world's will. Therefore, it wasn't something that living beings could understand, and the various things it displayed were completely different from living beings. However, its instincts weren't much different from living beings. Such instincts had an indescribable fear towards death, and an immeasurably urgent desire towards existence. With that being the case, its own concept of existence was being continuously attacked and destroyed by Luo Fan on the conceptual level, which naturally triggered its instincts and caused its potential to burst out. Under that burst of potential, the power of the tribulation brazenly broke through the difference between reality and the conceptual level and charged into the conceptual level. In that instant, the entire conceptual level surged without stopping. Like a huge rock being thrown into a calm lake, ripples after ripples began to spread in all directions from where the power rushed in. Countless concepts were completely destroyed by the impact. Everything it corresponded to was completely wiped out at the same time, and not a single trace was left in the hearts of all living beings and wills, as if it had never existed in the first place. It's here. At that moment, Luo Fan also noticed the existence of that will, and the thought flashed through his mind. Although it wasn't part of his plans for the power to appear here, nor did he predict that it would definitely appear here. However, in reality, if one were to think about it, one would know that its appearance was completely reasonable. After all, this was the third great calamity targeting him. How could there be no opponents at the final moment of such a great calamity? Even under the guidance of his own existence, the power of the tribulation would definitely cross the boundary and charge into the conceptual level to resist him. Although the way it appeared was unexpected, it was also reasonable. The place where the power appeared was around the huge concept, and it completely enveloped the huge concept. In other words, after it appeared, while it messed up the entire conceptual level, it also enveloped Luo Fan's concept of existence. In the blink of an eye, the endless crushing and repulsive force acted on Luo Fan's concept of existence, which had already turned into a sphere of light. It caused the impact, weakening, and crushing of the huge concept of existence to become 100 times more difficult. Faintly, it felt like it was difficult to move an inch forward, and the continuous depletion of the huge concept naturally slowed down, and it seemed like it was about to stop. Chapter 1942. An indescribable fluctuation began to emanate from his concept of existence. Along with this fluctuation, all the surrounding concepts were mobilized. All kinds of indescribable impacts erupted from these concepts and rushed towards the terrifying power that appeared around these concepts at this moment. This kind of control over other concepts on the concept level was something he had never possessed in the past. It was only after comprehending the concept level for such a long time and having such a deep understanding of the concept level that he could barely achieve this. However, that was just pushing the trend of these concepts. If he wanted to reverse the trend of these concepts with his current understanding of the concept level, it was still extremely insufficient, of course. This was already enough at this moment. For this concept level, all existences that did not belong to this concept level would be rejected by all the concepts within it. The power that came from the tribulations naturally belonged to the scope of its rejection. The reason why it did not show any rejection before was because the previous power was too powerful, and its essence was too high. Now, with Luo Fan's push, its rejection of that power erupted at the same time, and the resulting effect was terrifying enough to shake heaven and earth. In the blink of an eye, the power that belonged to the tribulations had produced an endless explosion. During this explosion, more and more power could not be maintained on this concept level, and it was brazenly knocked down and returned to the real world in this way. The originally extremely tight encirclement of that huge concept became like a sieve at this moment. The obstruction and suppression of Luo Fan's concept of existence was naturally equivalent to no longer existing. Faced with this situation, Luo Fan's heart suddenly relaxed. Although he had enough confidence in the power of the tribulations before, that was, after all, the power of the tribulations. The pressure it brought him was still unparalleled, after all. He could not truly relax completely. Now, he discovered that the power of the tribulations had turned into a sieve under his control, and the threat it posed to him had almost completely disappeared. Only then did he truly confirm what he had faintly known before, and his heart naturally relaxed because of this. As he relaxed, his intellect became extremely lively. Countless kinds of inspiration to resist that power and the huge concept were stimulated in his heart. In an instant, his concept of existence began to change. It was as if some kind of human-shaped shadow was casting all kinds of magical powers inside the concept of existence. All kinds of attacks aimed at the concept of existence burst out from the spherical concept of existence, covering the sky and earth as they pounced on the huge concept of existence. During this process, the power of the tribulation naturally reacted, and all sorts of profound changes appeared within it. Illusory images of different worlds and concepts were constantly being born from the power of tribulations. Even the massive concept itself began to transform along with the changes in this power, splitting into wisps of power. Bits and pieces of wonderful concepts blocked all kinds of terrifying attacks derived from Luo Fan's concept of existence. Luo Fan, who could directly control the concept of existence to attack, did not care about such a crude defense at all. Each of the attacks from his concept of existence bypassed the resistance of the power and the shielding of the giant concept in a miraculous way. It was as if a knife had sliced off a piece of meat on that huge concept, causing that huge concept to crumble, bit by bit. At the same time, the power of the tribulation was still withstanding the crazy rejection of the surrounding concepts. However, the essence of the remnant power was relatively high, and its resistance to the rejection of the concept was relatively strong, so it had been difficult to see any effect. Only at this moment, when Luo Fan's concept of existence attacked, causing a huge impact on that huge force and causing astonishing damage to that huge concept itself, the foundation of that force's existence was shaken. Finally, it could no longer maintain its conceptual level, and was expelled by that repulsive force at a speed that was 10 times or even 100 times faster than before. It fell to the level of reality and disappeared from the conceptual level. As a result, a vicious cycle was formed. The power of the tribulation couldn't withstand the impact of Luo Fan's concept of existence, So the resistance of the power of the tribulation against the repulsive power was weakened, causing more of the tribulation's power to be expelled out of the concept. This caused the resistance of the huge concept to weaken, causing the impact of Luo Fan's concept of existence to weaken the huge concept more and more easily, and also more and more quickly. And this, once again, started the cycle from just now, and just like that, the cycle would repeat again and again, never to be broken. This process continued to develop. After an unknown amount of time, all the power of the tribulation no longer remained on the plane of concept. All the power had been knocked down and returned to reality. The huge concept had also been reduced to less than 1/10,000th of its original size. Compared to Luo Fan's concept of existence, this was still about 100 times larger. Looking at the huge concept in front of him, Luo Fan faintly felt an indescribable sense of danger. Being weakened to this extent was undoubtedly a great success. It meant that he had gained the absolute upper hand in the battle against the third great tribulation. But at the same time, it also meant that he had reached the most dangerous moment, because it meant that the tribulation was very likely to erupt with a final attack that would take him down with it. Just like the other Luo Fan back then, thinking back to the artificial innate inextinguishable spiritual light that the other Luo Fan had created at the last moment, one could imagine how terrifying and unbelievable the final attack this tribulation, which was much stronger than the other Luo Fan, would be in its final frenzy. At this moment, Luo Fan raised his vigilance to its peak. He was constantly attacking. While constantly weakening the existence of the tribulation, he also left a part of his mind to be on guard against any possible attacks that might erupt from the tribulation. The kind of terrifying attack that could turn the tables. Just as he was on guard, time passed again. After an unknown period of time. It even made Luo Fan feel that his vigilance was a little unnecessary. The power of the tribulation didn't change much. Just as it was about to completely sink, a change occurred. The existence of the tribulation, which had been weakened by half and seemed to be only about 40 to 50 times larger than Luo Fan's concept of existence, suddenly froze. Then, the concept began to shrink. It began to shrink abruptly, as if an incomparably huge black hole had suddenly appeared in the deepest part of it. Not good. Facing this situation, Luo Fan knew that things were not good. He hurriedly controlled his concept of existence and began to retreat. At the same time, with his understanding of concepts, he guided the endless concepts around him to gather in front of him, constantly blocking himself and the existence of the tribulation. It wasn't that he didn't want to use more active methods to resist the existence of the tribulation, but because his current offensive had already reached his limit. That was to say, with his current understanding of the concepts, it was impossible for him to understand them. With his control over his own concept of existence, the strongest attack he could unleash was only at the level that he had unleashed during the long period of time just now. When he realized that the tribulation might be desperate, he had already unleashed his strongest attack and launched it at the huge concept. Under such circumstances, the only thing he could do was, of course, to protect himself first and free himself from the counterattack of the existence of the tribulation. Just as he arranged tens of thousands of concepts in front of him, when he formed a shield, the existence of the tribulation had shrunk to the size of a small dot. That small dot. It couldn't even be seen. It felt like a small dot of a concept. It appeared where the existence of the tribulation originally was. It suddenly paused. Then, an earth-shattering explosion erupted from that small. However, this explosion wasn't like the explosion of a bomb. But it happened in an extremely mysterious way. It had only produced a huge shock wave, that's all. The small dot itself didn't collapse because of this, nor was it destroyed because of this. That huge shock wave was constantly unleashed at this time, producing an indescribably terrifying impact. In that impact, the countless concepts that Luo Fan had arranged in front of his own concept suffered a huge blow. Countless concepts collapsed under this impact, completely turning into nothingness and vanishing into nothingness. However, after all, with the shield blocking it, although Luo Fan felt the existence of the impact, because it had been weakened layer by layer, he didn't suffer any damage because of it. However, in the face of this situation, Luo Fan was even more shocked. He retreated even faster and used an even stronger will to summon other concepts to pile up in front of him to make up for the shield formed by the concept. He felt an extremely strong sense of danger. If he didn't do this, his life would be in an extremely severe crisis. The source of all the changes in that small dot was none other than compressing most of the explosive power inside in order to brew an even more violent change. At this time, Luo Fan's actions had just produced a slight effect, summoning a considerable part of the twisting force in front of him to make up for the huge shield. At this time, the change brewed by the compression of most of the explosive force inside the small dot had finally been stimulated. A ball of flame appeared above that small dot. This kind of flame also belonged to the concept level. In other words, it was a concept of absolute combustion. The appearance of this concept of absolute combustion immediately ignited the small dot itself, completely transforming the concept of the existence of the catastrophe into this concept of absolute combustion. At this moment, it could be said that Luo Fan's third great tribulation had been passed. As long as he could survive under this concept of absolute combustion, after all, after completely transforming into this concept of absolute combustion, the concept of the existence of the third catastrophe no longer existed. In other words, the third tribulation had already disappeared, and this, obviously, this meant that Luo Fan had already endured the third great calamity. However, facing the fact that he had passed the third catastrophe. At this time, Luo Fan only felt an indescribable bitterness in his heart, because he had no confidence in resisting this concept of absolute combustion. After completely devouring and igniting the concept of the existence of the catastrophe, the flame had already expanded tens of thousands of times, from the original bean-like flame to a huge torch, and then it began to turn the surrounding concepts into more and more concepts. Or as fuel, it continued to devour them, causing its torch-like appearance to gradually expand. During this process, many concepts around it disappeared and were continuously devoured, causing the place to gradually turn into a huge bonfire. Then, from the bonfire, a huge pile of flames appeared. It turned into a large sea of fire, constantly rushing towards Luo Fan's concept of existence. At this time, Luo Fan regretted it again, and rejoiced. He regretted and rejoiced for the same goal, which was to summon so many concepts in front of him to form a shield. The reason why he regretted this was very simple. Because these shields were also composed of concept. Their existence was a large amount of fuel for the concept of absolute combustion, which could continuously strengthen the concept of absolute combustion. It would become stronger and more terrifying. And the reason why he felt rejoiced, the reason was not complicated. Because, if these concepts did not serve as a shield, then what became the fuel would become his own concept of existence. Due to this complicated mentality, he quickly retreated, constantly distancing himself from the concept of absolute combustion. At this conceptual level, there must be a concept that targets this concept of absolute combustion. Although it was the first time he had seen this concept of absolute combustion, Luo Fan was extremely certain of this. It was not difficult to speculate. After all, although this concept of absolute combustion was condensed by the power of the calamity by sacrificing itself, since it could appear, it meant that this concept of absolute combustion itself existed at the conceptual level. Endless concepts naturally had endless possibilities. Any concept that could be created by any person or existence must have appeared before. And since this concept of absolute combustion that could ignite all concepts had appeared before, and this conceptual level still existed and was still flourishing with such endless concepts, wouldn't it be natural for there to be some concept that could curb this concept of absolute combustion? After understanding that the concept of absolute combustion must have a concept of restraining it, he naturally knew what he had to do. For him, as long as he persisted long enough for the concept to restrain the concept of absolute combustion to appear and restrain it, then he would be considered to have truly survived this catastrophe. He would truly escape with his life. With this guiding ideology, Luo Fan tried his best to urge his concept of existence to run in the direction of the concept of absolute combustion. Perhaps due to the urging of the life and death crisis, the speed at which he controlled the concept of existence was now at least 10 times faster than when he thought of moving the huge concept over. Moreover, the speed was still constantly accelerating during the process. Such a change made the concept of absolute combustion closely follow his concept of existence as if it had already licked it, but in the end, it still could not really come into contact with his concept of existence. It was always that little bit away from reaching its goal. As for everything that was happening behind him, Luo Fan was very clear. Every time the concept of absolute combustion approached him, it made him break out in a cold sweat. Under the urging of the ever-approaching crisis of death, he controlled his concept of existence to move faster and faster. In fact, while the speed was increasing, the form of the concept of existence itself was also gradually changing. The halo that was originally around the sphere began to converge with all its might, trying its best to draw closer to the sphere itself. Get closer. In the end, the halo seemed to have turned into a thin layer of gauze that enveloped the sphere, causing it to shrink to the point where it could no longer shrink. This was the greatest possibility of reducing its volume, and the greatest possibility of avoiding the possibility of being engulfed and ignited by the concept of absolute combustion. Unknowingly, the entire concept had turned into a boundless sea of fire. The concept of absolute combustion had practically engulfed and transformed everything within the range of Luo Fan's senses into the concept of absolute combustion. The movement speed of Luo Fan's concept of existence was already extremely fast. However, its base speed was still too low. Even though he struggled with great difficulty for a few days, in the end, he still couldn't avoid the fate of being engulfed by the concept of absolute combustion. In the blink of an eye, Luo Fan felt boundless heat and pain gushing out from his concept of existence. All of his senses had already transformed into boundless flames. Chapter 1943. At this moment, the despair of death emerged from the bottom of Luo Fan's heart. At this moment, the structure of his concept of existence began to shake violently. Then, it began to collapse bit by bit. Traces of his concept of existence were constantly ignited, transformed into the concept of absolute combustion, and merged with the endless absolute combustion around him. Fortunately, after his concept of existence was enhanced by this worldview, he was no longer the same as before. But at this moment, even though his concept of existence was so damaged and quickly transformed into the concept of absolute combustion, his spiritual consciousness still existed, and it wasn't affected much. At this moment, he could still clearly sense everything, including the bit of clarity in his body that was gradually being ignited and replaced. Everything was within his perception. At this moment, he could only persist in this thought. As his concept of existence was constantly being ignited and devoured, he could only struggle and resist with all his might to slow down the speed at which he was completely ignited and replaced. Although it was impossible for him to resist the concept of absolute combustion, after all, he had a rather deep understanding of the concept level, and in the end, he was still able to barely slow it down. His spiritual consciousness still existed, and his perception was still clear. This didn't seem to be a good thing at this moment. At this moment, the horror of his concept of existence being ignited and the endless pain it brought were transmitted into his heart bit by bit. Every trace and every inch was completely accepted by him. If it was an ordinary cultivator, The moment they came into contact with this feeling, they would have collapsed, and their concept of existence would have been completely destroyed. Such pain was self-evident. It went without saying how unbearable it was, but Luo Fan could only bear it without holding anything back. That feeling, needless to say, after an unknown amount of time, when Luo Fan's own concept of existence was only left with the last trace, it seemed that it was about to completely disappear and be completely destroyed. Suddenly, the boundless concept of absolute combustion suddenly paused. It was as if time had suddenly stopped. Of course, there was no concept of time in this concept level, so this kind of pause was more subtle, more complicated, and more difficult to describe than ordinary time pauses. At this moment, Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat. He felt an indescribable sense of hope. It came from the bottom of his heart. Following his thoughts, the concept of absolute combustion began to transform again, transforming everything that it had devoured bit by bit and returning to its original position. The first to bear the brunt was obviously the concept of Luo Fan's existence. During this transformation, he felt an indescribably wonderful feeling. It was as if he was in the most beautiful place in the universe. It was the most wonderful state. Every minute, every second, every moment, he felt that he was growing. They all felt that they were becoming complete, becoming perfect. Immersed in this wonderful feeling, he once again forgot the passage of time. After an unknown period of time, a sense of completion surged into his mind. Then, he felt an indescribable sense of freedom, unfettered, and perfection surging up. Every sensation he felt was unprecedentedly beautiful. With this change, Luo Fan completely came back to his senses. He looked at the conceptual level and found that the sea of fire was rapidly retreating and shrinking. Although, during this process, the sea of fire had been transformed back to its original concept. However, after the sea of fire shrank, the surrounding scene still did not return to its original appearance. Instead, it became extremely distorted, like an abstract painting. The original appearance could not be found at all. Sure enough, without the support of the worldview, one can't maintain oneself in the end. Looking at this scene, Luo Fan came to a realization. The reason why these concepts that had been transformed by the concept of absolute combustion couldn't return to their original appearance was because the main body of those concepts didn't have enough strength to maintain themselves. In the process of being transformed by the concept of absolute combustion, their bodies had completely collapsed because they couldn't withstand this transformation. Now, even if they were transformed back by some incomparably mysterious conceptual mechanism, the lost self had already disappeared. No matter what, they couldn't return in the end. Because of this, such a situation was created. While he was thinking, the sea of fire had already converged back to its original mung bean-like state, just like when it first appeared. At this time, Luo Fan raised his vigilance. Next, if the concept of absolute combustion turned back to its original form, then it would turn back into the concept of existence of tribulations. If that was the case, wouldn't it mean that his third tribulations had returned? How could he not care about this situation? Although he knew that the probability of this happening was rather slim, there was still a certain possibility of it happening. At this moment, the concept of absolute combustion trembled slightly and degenerated once again, turning into a similarly extremely distorted concept. Looking at the size of the concept, and then looking at its distorted posture, Luo Fan knew that he could be completely at ease. "Looks like I've survived this tribulation," Qin Wentian muttered to himself. With this thought in mind, he suddenly felt a strong suction force acting directly on his body, pulling him. With a slight jolt, he had already left the conceptual level. At the same time, in the absolutely distorted heaven and earth, a figure appeared out of nowhere. This figure was clearly Luo Fan's appearance. Previously, after Luo Fan's body was destroyed, he was only left with a conceptual existence. Although his body still existed, he did not have a body. Now that he had been pulled out of the concept plane and his body had reappeared, it was clear that he needed to condense his body again and become the carrier of his concept of existence. That was the reason for the current situation. The concept of existence did not suffer any damage. On the contrary, it became unprecedentedly stable. For an existence at Luo Fan's level, it was naturally an extremely easy task to condense a new body. In the blink of an eye, that body. He had completely appeared in this distorted world. As he appeared, everything in his body that was originally dependent on his concept of existence also returned and appeared in his body. Among them was his innate inextinguishable spirit light. Everything within the innate inextinguishable spiritual light was contained within. I've finally fully recovered. Sensing everything in his body, Luo Fan sighed with emotion. He could not hide the relief on his face. In that instant, the entire distorted world began to collapse. It was originally just a distortion, but in just a short moment, it had completely turned into fragments that began to surge around his body like smoke. An indescribably terrifying impact force was released from the surrounding world and started to destroy everything that originally existed in this world. This included Luo Fan. However, this kind of destruction couldn't even get close to Luo Fan at this time. At the moment when it was about to pounce on him, the power had already dissipated by itself, as if it had never appeared at all. After all, this was a world with distorted concept. This kind of world was already extremely fragile, so the power that it produced was naturally also extremely fragile. When faced with Luo Fan's concept of existence, it naturally could not produce any effects. In the blink of an eye, it had completely collapsed and could no longer produce any effects. This could only happen in a distorted world that had no self. If it was in any other normal world, it would be impossible. If it was in other normal worlds, even if it was just an ordinary power, even if it could not harm Luo Fan, it would not collapse and dissipate so easily. Luo Fan stood there quietly with an indifferent expression on his face. His heart was filled with an indescribable joy. There was also an indescribable joy in his eyes. Unknowingly, the smoke that was formed by the surrounding fragments of the world started to gradually dissipate and turn into nothing. He reappeared in a world that he was extremely familiar with. That world was colliding with another world, a world that was essentially a fragment formed after the collapse of the Great World. His perception of the strange power that could bring him between different perfect worlds and the Earth universe had been completely restored at this moment. Faced with this situation, how could Luo Fan not understand that he had already completely passed the third tribulation? He was already one step closer to the supreme realm of true divine. With a slight jolt in his heart, he already knew how much time had passed in the outside world when he was in the third tribulation. It's only 100 years. After understanding everything, he could not help but smile. In fact, even if he had spent hundreds of thousands of years in the normal world, he had already spent hundreds of millions of years in the conceptual level. However, in reality, only less than 100 years had passed. It was so much so that even though the collision between the two worlds had already entered the middle phase, with a small portion of one world being devoured by the other, the true clash still hadn't arrived. At this moment, when he raised his head to look at the sky, the starry sky of the other world seemed to be hanging above his head and was pressing down on him, producing an indescribable deterrent force. Looking at the entire world, it had already become unprecedentedly barren. Even the creatures formed by the will of the world in the past no longer existed. It was as if they didn't exist at all. Clearly, the will of the world in this world had been completely destroyed in Luo Fan's third tribulation. But now, there were no longer any traces of its existence in this world. With a slight jolt in his heart, waves of law power began to surge out from Luo Fan's worldview of laws. They quickly filled up his body and replaced the endless power in his body with a posture that transcended time. With this change, his body gradually emitted a terrifying aura that shook the world. Under that aura, the world, which was already on the verge of collapse and was being torn apart by the other world, finally couldn't take it anymore. With him at the center, countless cracks started to spread in all directions, covering the entire world at an incomparably fast speed. During this process, the entire world seemed to be wrapped by a spider web that was getting bigger and thicker. The laws and laws of this world also began to become chaotic during this process. Although the various original natures were different, they could still maintain a balance under the moderation of other laws. The laws and laws that maintained stability and did not collide with each other completely lost their restraints and restrictions. They began to collide and kill each other without any reservations. The impact of this was, all the laws and laws began to riot. The four fundamental existences of this world pushed towards the chaotic abyss at an incomparably fast speed. The cracks that had already spread to the entire world suddenly seemed to have been pushed forward thousands of times. In a much shorter time than before, they quickly enveloped the entire world. Moreover, the chaos caused by the laws and laws caused by Luo Fan's aura also spread to every inch of spacetime in this world. In an instant, this world completely collapsed. At this moment, a strong sense of life and death crisis suddenly surged in Luo Fan's heart. For him, who had just escaped from the third tribulation, the feeling of dealing with a life and death crisis was too familiar. Instinctively, he had already stimulated the strange power in his body. An indescribable suction acted on his body. In a flash, his figure had already become blurry. Then, the world completely collapsed. When this place was about to be completely engulfed by the chaotic state, his figure had already brazenly disappeared amidst the boundless chaos. When he reappeared, he was already inside the mysterious energy. In other words, he was at the center of the mysterious energy. He had rushed to a platform in the boundless void. When he raised his head and looked in front of him, the two worlds that were originally colliding had already become a world that was wrapped in a layer of fog. That fog was none other than the countless fragments that had formed when the world that Luo Fan was in had collapsed. In other words, every speck of fog was an extremely large number of fragments. At this moment, the world that Empty Lady and the others were in seemed to have transformed into a vortex that began to continuously absorb the surrounding fog, causing it to continuously rush into that world. Every time a speck of fog rushed in, it would cause a flash of light in that part of the world, as if there was a huge explosion. Just like that, the dense fog continued to rush into it, and the light seemed to be endless. It was as if the light was always bright, and the sky and earth had turned from a planet into a huge sun. It seems that that world no longer needs my help. When Luo Fan saw this scene, he knew in his heart that there was no longer any suspense in the outcome of this collision. At this moment, the countless fragments of the world that had crashed into that world was indeed a disaster for the living beings in that world and the resistance force within it. This was because every bit of the fragment was like a planet that had smashed into that world. Now, the number of the fragments of the world that had turned into the surging fog that had enveloped the world was simply indescribable with trillions of words. Under such circumstances, it was equivalent to them having to deal with targets that had terrifying power and shocking destructive power but were not too numerous. Now they had to deal with targets that were much less powerful and destructive, but had a much greater number of targets. The number of targets had increased by countless times. If this reduction in power was satisfactory, such as reducing it to the point where it did not pose much of a threat to those living beings, it would naturally be a good thing for them. However, even if the fragments of the world had become even more fragmented and their power had decreased, it was still extremely powerful for living beings. It still exceeded the range of what they could bear, and they needed the combined strength of many living beings to be able to resist one of them. Under such circumstances, this change was clearly a disaster that was enough to make people despair. Under such circumstances, such a change was clearly a disaster that could make all living beings despair. For that world itself, the situation was already different. To the heaven and earth of the other world, the only thing that posed a threat was its size. Because there was not much difference in their sizes, the result of the collision could be the collapse and destruction of the other world, or it could also be the collapse and destruction of this world. Even if there was a difference in the probability of the two happening, it was not small. But now, the side that collided completely collapsed and turned into countless fragments. This obviously meant that the result was already fixed. In this way, for that world, the possibility of itself collapsing and being destroyed was naturally gone. Was this not a good thing? Knowing that the result was already set, Luo Fan also gave up on the idea of going to that world to help. He directly sat cross-legged on the platform and began to carefully consolidate the various improvements that he had obtained after passing through the Third Great Tribulation. Passing through the Third Great Tribulation was indeed an extremely painful experience for him, causing him to suffer endless pain that he had not even imagined in the past. However, at the same time, it was also a huge opportunity for him, allowing him to make progress that he did not even dare to imagine before. Chapter 1944. All sorts of indescribable feelings surfaced in Luo Fan's heart. In a trance, the world that he had experienced had unknowingly appeared in his heart. The primordial world, the great Tianyuan world, the Earth universe, and the place he had entered through the Earth universe were initially incomplete. However, with his help, it had become complete and perfect. At this moment, they all appeared in his heart. All sorts of things that had happened to his main body in the primordial world and his clone in the great Tianyuan world emerged in his heart without reservation. In the primordial world, Luo Fan had even taken ancestor Hong Jun as his disciple. In that world, he was definitely an invincible existence. Although he had already split into his main body and clone, both of them were still Luo Fan. Their wills were completely the same. Originally, even though the two of them were separated by the boundless chaos, they could still continuously communicate and balance their realms. At this moment, after his cultivation realm had increased, the two of them were finally connected without reservation. However, in an instant all aspects were reunited. All the gains that the clone had obtained in the Earth universe and other worlds for billions of trillions of years were fed back to the true body at the same time. In an instant, the cultivation realm of the true body advanced layer by layer. All the Dharma power and power in the body began to rapidly transform into the Dharma power of law. At this moment, the entire primordial world began to tremble slightly. Luo Fan's clone had been in the Earth's universe for hundreds of millions of years. In terms of the time that he had experienced, it had been billions of trillions of years. However, to the primordial world, his main body had only lived for 1,000,000 years. Compared to the newly born primordial world, 1,000,000 years was indeed not a short period of time. However, if it was used for cultivation, this time, obviously, it was far from enough. At the very least, all along, Luo Fan's main body did not have too many gains. All of the increase in his cultivation realm and all of his comprehension towards cultivation were obtained by synchronizing with his clone and communicating with it. This might be a little embarrassing for his main body. However, as a whole, he tried his best to reduce the Tao realm and the main body's cultivation conflicts, making it so that the cultivation of the clone could be the easiest. The smoothest thing was that it was fed back to the main body, allowing the main body's cultivation realm to rise smoothly like never before. Now, Luo Fan's main body was in the eyes of all living beings in the primordial world. He would be a saint through and through. It should be known that the primordial world had been born for such a long time, and even the primordial chi had not completely degenerated into the essence of the world. There were even remnants of the chaotic chi in some places. The cultivation level of all living beings was at most at the primordial zenith heaven realm. Even Hong Jun had only gone a little deeper in this realm. Under such a background, Luo Fan, who far surpassed the innate grand Luo realm, even surpassed the quasi-saint realm, the false saint realm, the false saint realm, the supreme monarch realm, and so on, was simply like a giant suddenly appearing in an ant's nest. In the eyes of the ants, wasn't the power of this giant absolute, invincible, and unshakable? In terms of status, the current Luo Fan was even higher than the legendary Hong Jun in the primordial world. Luo Fan sat cross-legged in the void. Billions of rays of light radiated from his body and penetrated the entire boundless world. It was as if there was an additional sun in the sky of this world. With a thought, he raised his hand and grabbed at the void. A palace appeared in his hand. This was none other than the Void Wuji Palace that he had refined from the very beginning. After his Tao realm had risen again and again, after he had refined the Void Wuji Palace again and again, the palace had not only perfectly realized the structure that he had designed, but it had also reached a state where he could absolutely do as he pleased. In other words, no matter what the Void Wuji Palace was like in the past, whether it was integrated into the world, or integrated into himself, or existed alone, he could now change it and change it at will. Just like at this moment, he completely plucked it out and placed it in his hand. Looking at the everlasting Void Palace, he suddenly smiled and clasped his hands together. A boundless and terrifying might was released from his hands, brazenly pressing down on the limitless Void Palace. As the boundless and terrifying power pressed down, the Void Wuji Palace suddenly collapsed. Endless worlds shot out from it and splashed in all directions. This change directly caused the entire primordial world to shake violently. Endless thunder and endless roars were transmitted from the places where the worlds passed by, covering the entire world and all living beings. For a moment, countless living beings were trembling in fear and panic. Only Luo Fu and the others, who had a close relationship with Luo Fan, could feel the familiar aura. An indescribable joy surged in their hearts. At this time, what Luo Fan wanted to do was to completely integrate the limitless Void Palace into the world, turning it into an extremely special group of worlds in the world. It should be known that after the Void Wuji Palace was opened up layer by layer, it had already become a minor kiliacosm, a medium kiliacosm, and a major kiliacosm. In addition, the speed of the flow of time was different. Whether it was the scale or the wonder, it had already far exceeded the imagination of all living beings. Such an existence integrated into the primordial world and fed back to the supreme great Tao of the primordial world. It could definitely add all kinds of indescribable mysteries to the supreme great Tao. It caused the entire primordial world to become more and more profound. It was even enough to change the growth direction of the entire world. Of course, this kind of situation could only appear at the beginning of the world, even if the primordial world had already passed through two great tribulations. Compared to other perfect worlds, they could no longer be considered novices in terms of tribulation transcendence level. However, looking at the time, they could only be calculated in millions of years. Compared to other perfect worlds that could easily take billions or trillions of years, this was not the beginning of the world. What was the beginning of the world? Things. However, it was almost completely according to Luo Fan's plan. The endless worlds in the Void Wuji Palace continued to integrate into the primordial world. They merged with the laws of the world itself and interacted with the supreme great Tao of the world. Not only did they change the supreme great Tao of the world, but they also changed the worlds themselves. Then, the endless minor kiliacosm, medium kiliacosm, major kiliacosm, and even a world that was brewing above these levels, which was between the major kiliacosm and the perfect world. As they gradually integrated into the world, they gradually became an inseparable part of the world. A brand new balance that combined the primordial world began to be established between the many worlds. With this balance, just as Luo Fan had expected, the supreme great Tao gave birth to all kinds of indescribable mysteries. The speed at which the connate essence energy of the entire world degenerated was as if there was a propeller, and it kept accelerating. In the past, before he returned to the Earth universe, Luo Fan thought that the connate essence energy transforming into the heaven and earth essence energy was a kind of degeneration. It was just like the chaotic essence energy transforming into the connate essence energy. However, after experiencing so many things and seeing so many worlds, he gradually understood that although this kind of change was a kind of degeneration and a reduction in energy level for the essence energy itself, it was a kind of progress for the world and all living beings in it. In other words, the evolution of the connate essence energy into the heaven and earth essence energy basically meant that the world was growing. The reason was very simple. It was because the connate essence energy was not something else. It was the foundation of any world. If the yuan qi in a part of the world was always connate yuan qi, then it meant that the foundation of that part of the world was constantly being released and being consumed at all times. In this way, how could the world improve? How could it grow? For living beings, the essence energy in the world was the connate essence energy. Although it could give them a lot of benefits in a short period of time, allowing them to obtain longevity without cultivating. However, this was consuming the foundation of the world. To obtain longevity in such a way and absorb such essence energy to increase one's cultivation was a sin against the heavens. Perhaps one could increase one's cultivation at an extremely fast speed in a short period of time. However, in the long run, one would become more and more unlucky, and the opportunities one encountered would become fewer and fewer in the end. When this kind of bad luck developed to an extreme, one might even choke to death from drinking a mouthful of water. However, once the essence energy in any world was transformed into the heaven and earth essence energy, the situation would obviously be different. Compared to the connate essence energy, the heaven and earth essence energy was acquired, but it was a renewable resource for the world. No matter how much the heaven and earth essence energy was consumed, it would not damage the foundation of the world. On the contrary, the greater the consumption of the heaven and earth essence energy, it could even accelerate the energy circulation of the world, causing the world to circulate more smoothly. This would instead bring about considerable benefits to the world. In this way, if a cultivator absorbed the heaven and earth essence energy to cultivate, although it might not make his luck better, he would not become more unlucky. This was obviously a huge benefit. In this way, the connate essence energy transforming into the heaven and earth essence energy was clearly beneficial to both the world and living beings. This was, of course, a form of growth. Currently, the speed at which the connate essence energy in the primordial world was transforming into the heaven and earth essence energy was accelerating. This clearly meant that the growth of the primordial world was accelerating. This was also in line with Luo Fan's previous expectations. The acceleration of the growth of the world also brought about a result that was unknown whether it was good or bad. That was, the arrival of the third great tribulation of the primordial world had begun to rapidly advance. Before Luo Fan merged the limitless void palace into the primordial world, it would still be billions of years before the third great tribulation of the primordial world. There was still a lot of time for all living beings to grow and for the will of the world to continue brewing. However, as Luo Fan completely merged the limitless void palace into the world, the time for the third great tribulation of the world to descend had already been advanced from the original billions of years to millions of years. Although Luo Fan did not expect such a situation, he appeared rather calm. The primordial world. After all, it was a world that had developed normally. It was a great tribulation of the world. In fact, compared to the tribulation of heaven and earth that he had created, it was much weaker. Compared to the tribulation of earth and the universe, the tribulation of heaven and earth in that imperfect world, it was much weaker. To Luo Fan, who had already passed the third great tribulation, this level of great tribulation of the world obviously did not cause much pressure. Not to mention that he still had millions of years to prepare. Even if it appeared now, he was confident that he could survive it. There were millions of worlds in the limitless void palace. If he wanted to fuse all of them into the world, he would have to do so. It was obviously a huge project. Even if it was Luo Fan, if he wanted to complete it and make all the worlds merge into the world, it would still take quite a long time. This process, it lasted for a whole year. After a year, Luo Fan completely merged the last world into the primordial world. The countless worlds in the limitless void palace re-established a complete system in the outside world, forming a strange group of worlds in the primordial world. I finally succeeded. Seeing that the group of worlds had begun to be established, the time flow of the layers of worlds began to stack up again. This thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind. With this change, a connate inextinguishable spiritual light that had been brewing for millions of years suddenly shrank and turned into a ball. It began to inexplicably resonate with the outside world. Compared to his split body, Luo Fan's original body was attached to the primordial world, which had just been formed. The opportunity was obviously more powerful. Back then, his clone had worked hard and even spent who knew how many hundreds of millions of years to barely take possession of a strand of innate indestructible spirit light. He had left his mark on the innate indestructible spirit light. However, his original body had easily obtained two connate inextinguishable spiritual lights. Now one of them had been integrated into his divine soul, waiting for his divine soul to refine it and give its connate inextinguishable spiritual light to his own divine soul. As for the other one, although he had also placed it in his divine soul, he had let it evolve naturally. After endless time, it would turn into a real primordial origin spiritual treasure. This kind of luxury, compared to the bitterness of the split body, was like the difference between heaven and earth. If it were not for the fact that his original body and his split body shared the same will, perhaps Luo Fan's split body would have been jealous of his original body. And now, what was changing was the connate inextinguishable spiritual light that was evolving into a primordial origin spiritual treasure. At this moment, it was activating the evolution that had been brewing for millions of years, and was transforming into a spiritual treasure embryo. As for why this kind of transformation happened at this moment, there were two reasons. Firstly, at this moment, he had already rejected all foreign objects other than the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. His body had become incomparably pure, and his fusion with the connate inextinguishable spiritual light had become unprecedentedly deep. As a result, the connate inextinguishable spiritual light had become unprecedentedly active. Secondly, at this moment, he had helped the primordial world grow and even faintly changed the direction of its growth. This caused the primordial world to instinctively get close to him. Therefore, it instinctively opened up a mysterious authority that was not open to him before. And this authority allowed the unprecedentedly active connate inextinguishable spiritual light to absorb endless nutrients. Finally, it crossed that boundary and finally obtained this crucial transformation. From the connate inextinguishable spiritual light, it transformed into a spiritual treasure embryo. This spiritual treasure embryo was completely different from the spiritual treasure embryo that his clone had obtained. The foundation of the split spirit treasure embryo wasn't indestructible. Although it was already a spirit treasure embryo and possessed the characteristics of indestructibility, it wasn't truly indestructible. Once the attack exceeded a certain limit, the spirit treasure embryo would eventually be destroyed. However, the spiritual treasure embryo of the main body was completely different. Because its foundation was the connate inextinguishable spiritual light, it had the characteristics of indestructibility. Therefore, no matter how strong the attack was, it would at most be scattered and turned back into the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. This difference caused the safety of the two spiritual treasure embryos to be greatly different. While Luo Fan was thinking, the changes of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light continued. After the entire connate inextinguishable spiritual light shrank into the shape of a ball, it began to shrink and tremble slightly, faintly resonating with the outside world. It was like a heartbeat, but also like a huge, living creature was breathing. And with this change, the image of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light also gradually changed. A thin veil of light appeared on the ball, and the ball itself seemed to be filled with endless mysteries, becoming indescribably complex and subtle. Vaguely, an aura that belonged to the worldview gradually emerged from it. That's right, the image that the connate inextinguishable spiritual light had evolved was the image of the worldview that had been condensed. Obviously, it had evolved completely according to the state of Luo Fan's body and mind, and according to the state of his worldview. This change lasted for 100 years before it finally stopped. Chapter 1945. As the spiritual treasure embryo was formed, the countless rays of light radiating from Luo Fan's body gradually disappeared. After a while, they turned invisible. The rays of light that had lasted for such a long time suddenly disappeared out of thin air in a day. This made the living beings in the untainted land unable to react for a while. After a while, they realized that the changes that had made them tremble with fear for such a long time had finally passed. For a moment, all living beings heaved a sigh of relief, and their expressions became relaxed. Is everything over? Somewhere in the world, Hong Jun, who was standing on the top of a mountain, had such a thought. Previously, all living beings were shocked by the various changes in the untainted land caused by Luo Fan, but they were just shocked. Very few living beings could comprehend anything from the changes. However, Hong Jun was Hong Jun after all. His talent and willpower were much stronger than all living beings. In this light, he could feel the source of all these changes. He could feel the innate spirit light that was leaking out from Luo Fan's body, and the mysteries of the innate spirit light. Through the understanding of these various mysteries, he had unknowingly advanced into a cultivation realm. The mana in his body was broken again and again and again and again. During this process, the nature of the mana gradually changed and the essence of the mana gradually improved. In such a short period of time, he had already improved by many times and reached the peak of the innate zenith heaven. He was only a thin piece of paper away from the sage-to-be realm. Even the distance of this thin piece of paper was only left behind because he pursued perfection and wanted to use the most perfect method to become a sage-to-be. With such a huge gain, he was naturally extremely reluctant to part with the rays of light emitted from Luo Fan's body. At this moment, when he realized that the rays of light had disappeared, he naturally showed a look of disappointment on his face. Just as Hong Jun was feeling disappointed, a voice that he had been looking forward to suddenly echoed in his ears. Just as Hong Jun was feeling disappointed, a voice that he had been looking forward to suddenly echoed in his ears. Come here. Hearing this, Hong Jun was overjoyed. He immediately bowed and responded. His figure turned into a long rainbow and soared into the sky. He quickly rushed toward the place where he felt the light was coming from. After so many years of development, the primordial world had become extremely prosperous in terms of vitality. The huge continents were filled with living beings, and a prosperous cultivation civilization had developed, giving birth to countless cultivators. If it was in the past, Hong Jun would fly. He would definitely try to hide himself and hide his movement light. But at this time, he was looking forward to meeting Luo Fan. How could he care about anything else? At this moment, he only wanted to increase his speed. He allowed the rainbow to linger behind him for a long time without dissipating. As a result, any living beings that looked up from the continents it passed by would see a long arc of light that lingered in the sky for a long time. It did not dissipate for a long time, as if a wondrous scene had suddenly appeared in the sky. Meanwhile, in other parts of the world, there were also long arcs of light rising into the sky and gathering towards Luo Fan. If one were to look at these changes from a macroscopic perspective, one would see that there were streaks of rainbows that were like the ribs of umbrellas that were constantly converging towards a certain place from all over the world. These were none other than Luo Fan's disciples. Obviously, Hong Jun was not the only one who had heard these sounds just now. His other disciples had also heard these sounds. At this time, they were also anxiously rushing towards Luo Fan from all directions like Hong Jun. Luo Fan was sitting in the middle of the world in the Void Wuji Palace. In the real world, his figure had completely disappeared, leaving only nothingness in place. Under him there was a vast platform. Around the platform there were specks of light, like stars in the starry sky, decorating the surroundings. Those were the minor kiliocosms, medium kiliocosms, and boundless kiliocosms. In terms of quantity, the number of these countless specks of light was not much less than the stars in the starry sky. Luo Fan had accepted a total of 6 disciples in this untainted world. Hong Jun, Luo Fu, Guang Pu, Lin Tiannan, Gu Ling, Lei Jiuxiao, and the 2 children of Luo Fu and Guang Pu. There were a total of 8 people. At this moment, the 8 of them gathered at Luo Fan's location from all over the world as fast as they could. This scene was simply a shocking change for all living beings in this world. After all, the 8 of them had accumulated a great reputation in this long period of time, and all of them had become great figures. They suddenly moved at the same time, and they looked so anxious and impatient. Anyone who saw this would suspect that something big had happened in this world, and they needed to deal with it at the same time. Among the 8 of them, even Lin Tiannan, who was the weakest, was already at the innate Grand Luo realm. It went without saying that they were able to travel at such a fast speed. Even though the untainted world was billions of light-years wide, it could not stop their speed. In just a day, even Lei Jiuxiao, who was the furthest away, had already sensed where Luo Fan was and saw the empty void. Disciple Hong Jun, Luo Fu greets Master, Father, Grandfather. May Master live forever. They did not exchange pleasantries. After everyone arrived, they kowtowed in the void and shouted. They were not surprised that they did not see Luo Fan. After all, Luo Fan was omnipotent in their hearts. He was elusive, so it was normal that they did not see him. Compared to that, it was strange to see him waiting here. At this moment, the void shook slightly. Then, it was as if 2 invisible arms were grabbing the void and pushing it apart, causing the void to split from the center. A group of worlds was revealed. There, they saw Luo Fan, whom they had missed for more than 1,000,000 years. At this moment, Luo Fan looked at them and smiled. He said, "Come, I have some enlightenment this time, so I want to talk about Tao with you." Hearing this, Hong Jun and the others' eyes lit up. Every time they heard Luo Fan talk about Tao, they all gained a lot. They all had great gains. The reason why they were able to make such great progress in such a short period of time was because Luo Fan had explained the Tao to them so many times. Now they heard that Luo Fan was going to talk about Tao with them again, and it seemed to be a very important Tao that even Luo Fan had to treat with caution. How could they not be excited? How could they not be happy? Yes! Everyone shouted excitedly. At that moment, he directly sat in front of Luo Fan. In fact, there were many other disciples under Luo Fan's tutelage. For example, the 3 female innate gods and the 2 flood dragons that he had tricked into becoming the mountain-guarding divine beasts. However, because the content of what he was going to talk about this time was too important, he did not want to reveal it to them for the time being. Therefore, he did not summon them. That was the reason why only Hong Jun and the other 7 people were here. This time, I want to talk to you about the principle of achieving the mixed Yuan Tao fruit. Luo Fan's first sentence stunned Hong Jun and the others. Their expressions changed greatly because of this sentence. Their eyes became extremely solemn and serious. Previously, when I traveled the heavens, I saw countless cultivation systems and learned about countless Tao of cultivation. Now I will tell you all about my various understandings. I hope that you can comprehend your own way to achieve Tao and become a true sage in the future. Luo Fan looked at the 8 of them and sighed. Among the 8 of them, Hong Jun was the most likely to become a true sage. After all, if Hong Jun did not transmigrate, he seemed to be the kind of existence that could become a true sage. Now that he had experienced his cultivation, Hong Jun could only be stronger than before and not weaker than before. It could be said that as long as the method was correct, becoming a true sage was almost inevitable. After him, it was Luo Fu, Guang Pu, Luo Chunyang and their families. After them, it was Lin Tiannan, Gu Ling, Lei Jiuxiao and the others. It could even be said that they could be regarded as the Crown Prince's study companions. However, no matter what, since he had already accepted them as his disciples, he naturally had to be responsible for them. He naturally had to guide them on the path that he thought was the most correct and smoothest. At that moment, he calmed himself down and began to slowly explain to the 8 of them the various realms of cultivation and the importance of the worldview in becoming a true sage. This time, there were no extravagant flowers falling from the sky or golden lotuses surging out of the ground. There was only a faint, clear light emitted from his body and enveloped the entire group of worlds, isolating the entire group of worlds from the primordial world outside. No matter what happened or what sound was produced, it could not be leaked out. Under the cover of the clear light, Hong Jun and the others all felt indescribably clear. He remembered every word that Luo Fan spat out with unprecedented clarity, as if he had deeply engraved them at the bottom of his heart. Although the words that Luo Fan used were simple, there was a deeper mystery in his tone, and the intensity of his voice. With the current level of Hong Jun and the others, if it wasn't for the clear light that Luo Fan's body emitted, it would be impossible for them to completely remember all of this. As a result, they wouldn't be able to further comprehend the deeper mysteries contained in these words after their own cultivation realm had increased. Precisely because of this, Luo Fan had to use his own will to create an environment that could not only isolate the movement inside and outside, but also allow them to remember more mysteries in his words in the process. This time, the preaching did not take long. In just a short 3 days, Luo Fan had already integrated everything that he wanted to say into his words and engraved them in the hearts of Hong Jun and the others. Just as he stopped preaching, there was a sudden crackling sound coming from Hong Jun's body. As the sound rang out, an endless amount of power slowly dispersed from his body, gradually merging with the surrounding void. It was gradually devoured by the void. With this change, Hong Jun's aura began to weaken rapidly. From a distance of a piece of paper away from becoming a sage to be, he became an ordinary innate Grand Luo in the blink of an eye. In the blink of an eye, he fell back to the primordial pure yang level, and in the blink of an eye, he became an earth immortal and so on and so forth. In just a few short breaths, he had already brazenly turned from a peak innate Grand Luo expert to an ordinary mortal without any cultivation base. It was very obvious that after he heard what Luo Fan had said, he resolutely gave up all his past achievements in cultivation and prepared to recultivate. Seeing this, Luo Fan sighed and focused his will. The clear light gathered around Hong Jun and directly protected his body. This allowed him to exist safely in the void at the center of the world group and not be harmed at all. At this moment, Luo Fu and the others finally realized what had happened. All of a sudden, their expressions changed. There was admiration, disbelief, and some even had an inexplicable realization. They seemed to have figured out why Hong Jun was so much stronger than them despite having the same cultivation base. "Thank you, Master." Hong Jun kowtowed at Luo Fan. At this moment, his expression was calm and indifferent. Although he no longer had any cultivation base and his cultivation base had completely disappeared, there was an indescribable light of enlightenment in his eyes. It seemed like he was more clear-headed than before and his spiritual state was higher. "Don't stand on ceremony. Now that you have no cultivation base, It's not safe for you to go anywhere else. Why don't you recultivate here? Luo Fan said calmly. Yes. Hong Jun responded and bowed again. He got up and sat down with his legs crossed. He began to gather energy bit by bit and began to push it in his body. Compared to normal recultivation, Hong Jun's speed of recultivation this time was much slower. It was even slower than when he obtained his cultivation base and cultivation base from nothing. It was as if he spent hundreds, thousands, or even tens of thousands of times more time and energy to comprehend every bit of improvement and improvement. Luo Fan knew at a glance that he was sorting out his understanding of the world and everything in the world bit by bit during this process. He wanted to sort out his worldview bit by bit during the process of cultivation. This method, compared to what he did in the past, when he had a powerful cultivation base, he went into seclusion to sort out his mind and memories, and to organize and consolidate his worldview. Although his cultivation base was not strong enough, so the speed was extremely slow, but it was better in terms of a solid foundation. Every piece of the worldview that he sorted out had an extremely deep integration with him. This integration would weaken the obstacles that prevented him from perfectly integrating his worldview with himself in the future. From a certain point of view, this was more beneficial than Luo Fan's choice of going into closed-door cultivation in the Khanate Grand Luo realm for millions of years to sort out his worldview. Of course, there was a crucial difficulty in making this choice to seek fortune and avoid disaster. It required a powerful force to protect him from the danger of losing his cultivation base. "You guys go," said Luo Fan with a sigh in his heart when he saw Luo Fu and the others wavering. Luo Fu and the others were slightly relieved, but soon they felt inexplicably ashamed. "Don't mind it. This is your own cultivation. You don't have to compare yourself with others. Your eldest senior brother's choice is the best choice for him, but it might not be the same for you." Luo Fan smiled and comforted them. Hearing this, Luo Fu and the others recovered. They bowed to Luo Fan one by one before gradually dispersing and leaving the world cluster. At this moment, their hearts were filled with boundless gratitude towards Luo Fan. They were no longer muddle-headed creatures like before. Now that they had been tempered for a long period of time, their minds and temperaments had reached an extremely profound level. How could they not know how precious the things that Luo Fan had just told them were? How could they not understand how rare it was for Luo Fan to share these things with them, and how much care he had shown them? They believed that if they knew everything Luo Fan knew, they would not hand over the knowledge to their disciples so easily. Even if their sons were among them, it would not be any different. This was not because they were selfish, but because it was human nature. Otherwise, why would those rich people only distribute their property to their children after they die? Why did the ancient emperors leave posthumous edicts to pass the throne to their children before they died? However, this time, Luo Fan told them the true way to become a true sage without reservation. This was the first time they saw the hope of transcendence since they were born. They saw the possibility of breaking away from the shackles of heaven and earth. How could they not be grateful for this kindness? In fact, it was because of this that they were so hesitant when facing Hongjuan's choice. Because they did not know if Hongjuan's action was what Luo Fan expected. Let's not separate for now. We need a long period of stability for our next cultivation. Let's put other things aside first. After leaving the world cluster, Luo Fu said to Guang Pu and Luo Chunyang. When Guang Pu and the rest heard this, they did not hesitate. They just nodded and agreed to this suggestion. Chapter 1946. Then, the primordial world fell into silence. It was as if nothing had happened. Only Hong Jun and the others knew what kind of intense change was brewing. Luo Fan was in the middle of the world group. With a wave of his hand, he sent Hong Jun to a world that was most suitable for him to cultivate in. Then, he closed his eyes and began to deduce. The third great tribulation of the untainted world was approaching at an astonishing speed. Although it was not too difficult for him, it was still a great tribulation of the heavens and earth. If he made a mistake, the entire world would be destroyed. Under such circumstances, no matter how confident he was, he had to spend enough time and energy to deal with the upcoming great tribulation of the world. Luo Fan's current cultivation realm had already reached an unimaginable level. Now, the arrival of the third great tribulation of the world could be considered traceable. In this way, it was not difficult for him to deduce the time when the great tribulation of the world would arrive. In the end, in just a few hours, he had already figured out the specific time when the great tribulation of the world would arrive. There are still 3 million years left. The third great tribulation of the primordial world would descend in 3 million years. Moreover, according to his deduction, the power of the great tribulation that would arrive would be at least 10,000 times stronger than the second great tribulation of the world. Even he might fail if he did not deal with it properly. It seems that regardless of whether it's earlier or later, as long as the great tribulation of the world doesn't arrive naturally, the difficulty will definitely increase. A kind of understanding appeared in his heart. Normally, the third great tribulation should be hundreds of times stronger than the second great tribulation. Now, it had suddenly increased by dozens of times on this basis. The change in difficulty could not be said to be small. He understood the time when the great tribulation would arrive and the extent of its increase. Luo Fan no longer hesitated and began to take action. Now, although the cultivation civilization in this world was already rather prosperous, even Hong Jun, who was under Luo Fan's tutelage and had been carefully nurtured by him, was merely a connate Grand Luo. What level could the other cultivators reach? It could be said that in the entire cultivation world, the Earth Immortal level was already the mainstream. The primordial unity pure yang level above this was considered the true expert. Beyond that was the innate grand immortal realm. That was a peerless powerhouse. Any one of them could proclaim themselves as the overlord of a continent. Facing the third great tribulation of heaven and earth with such a standard was clearly not enough. Although Luo Fan could help this world overcome the third great tribulation by himself, it was still too troublesome. Therefore, Luo Fan made a decision after some consideration. He wanted to preach the Tao. In fact, he was called the Tao ancestor by all living beings in the primordial world. He preached the Tao to all living beings and nurtured the entire cultivation world. Raising the level of the entire cultivation world seemed to be his responsibility. Luo Fan had already preached about the Tao in various worlds and worlds countless of times. His rich experience was something that few could compare to. Since the decision had been made, the lecture naturally took shape very quickly. In just a few days, all the continents in this part of the world had a stone tablet. This stone tablet had appeared out of thin air in the past few days. Every tablet towered into the clouds. Even the sea of clouds could only appear at the top of the center of the stone tablet. On these stone tablets, there were 4 words written in a mysterious language that all living beings, regardless of whether they were literate or illiterate, could understand. Stone Tablet of Immortal Serendipity. Furthermore, each of these 4 words contained boundless information. Anyone who saw the stone tablet would be able to comprehend the complicated and indescribable information contained behind these 4 words. For a moment, almost all living beings who could see the stone tablet understood that the peerless mighty figures in the world wanted to spread kindness, to preach the mysteries of the Tao of cultivation to all living beings. At that moment, the crowd was filled with emotions. Many living beings almost went crazy for this. They gathered towards the stone tablet from all directions and waited in front of the stone tablet for the immortal serendipity that was about to arrive. Just like that, 3 years passed in the blink of an eye. In the many continents, there were densely packed cultivators gathered around each stone tablet, waiting eagerly. Just as the information on the stone tablet stated that 3 years had passed, the stone tablet began to gradually emit a brilliant light. This brilliance was sparkling like the moon. It contained boundless profundities and indescribable information. The cultivators around the stone tablet were instantly enveloped by this light. An indescribable law descended on these cultivators. It extracted their wills and senses and threw them into the stone steels. Through the many stone steels, they were all connected to an indescribable world. There were only endless stars here. Arriving here was like arriving in space. At a glance, there was an indescribable feeling of vastness in one's heart. Of course, in addition to the stars that filled the sky, there were also countless cultivators. Many cultivators didn't know that there were so many cultivators in this world until now. It turned out that they were so insignificant in this world. Even though they were waiting for the arrival of the Almighty being preaching Tao, even though they knew this was a shocking opportunity for them. However, when the number of living beings increased, the indescribable noise still appeared. Because of their appearance, the entire universe seemed to have turned into a boundless, huge market, and was in a state of chaos. All of a sudden, a strange law descended upon this vast and boundless universe. Due to this law, the cultivators in the universe found that no matter how they opened their mouths, they couldn't make a single sound. Apart from their own breathing, they couldn't hear anything else. It was as if there was nothing else in the universe that could make a sound, creating an indescribable sense of loneliness. At this moment, a high platform appeared out of thin air in the center of the crowd. This high platform wasn't big. However, no matter where they were, no matter if there was anyone between them and the platform, they could see it at a glance. They could also clearly see the scene on the high platform. At this moment, there was a figure that no matter how much they strengthened their vision, even if they focused their mind, they still couldn't see the figure clearly. Immediately after, the figure started explaining the various principles and mysteries of the cultivation path from zero. Although the people couldn't hear the voices of other cultivators apart from their own bodies, the voices of the figure on the high platform seemed to be deeply engraved in their hearts. Every word and every tone could be heard clearly. Very clearly. Every single sound that the figure on the high platform made seemed to contain endless mysteries. Even the most irritable and impatient cultivator would involuntarily forget everything in the outside world as soon as they heard that voice. They completely forgot the rule that prevented them from making a sound or hearing anyone else's voice. Instead, they focused all of their attention on the sound that the figure on the high platform made. This universe was none other than the one that Luo Fan had casually opened up. It was a world between reality and illusion. The figure on the high platform, of course, it was him. At this moment, although the principles he was talking about were not profound. However, he had already integrated all his understanding of the cultivation path into it. Any cultivator who could comprehend just one or two of them would be able to improve step by step. They would be able to cross boundaries and directly push their cultivation realm to the pseudo-sage level. Once a cultivator's comprehension was high enough, and they could comprehend 30 to 40% of it, they wouldn't need to worry about the cultivation knowledge needed to become a pseudo-sage. If there was a person with heaven-defying aptitude, they would be able to completely comprehend the content of what he was talking about. Then, becoming a supreme emperor might not even be the end. It could be said that, although he had held back in his preaching this time, he didn't explain all the aspects of the world, but he had already done his best to improve the cultivators here. As for why he had to keep all the aspects of the world, there was no need to say more. That was the key to becoming a sage, the true core of one's cultivation. It was already very generous to pass it on to one's own disciple. Now, to announce it to almost all the cultivators in the entire untainted land, even a moral sage might have some possibility of doing it. And Luo Fan was obviously not a sage with morals. He sat there quietly with a calm look in his eyes. He slowly preached the fundamentals of the Tao of cultivation to almost all the cultivators in the primordial world. The preaching this time did not last long, but it was definitely not short either. It took him 300 years to tell her everything that he wanted to say. Among the many cultivators, only less than 30% of them could use their own abilities to separate their souls from their bodies for 300 years. They could not eat, drink, speak, or move. Under normal circumstances, after 300 years, most living beings should have died from exhaustion. However, it was obvious that this would not happen at this time. That was because Luo Fan was here. The preaching this time was the idea of Luo Fan. In other words, the reason why the many living beings were in a state where their souls were separated from their bodies for 300 years, where they did not eat, drink, speak, or move, was because of him. If most of the living beings died, wouldn't his preaching this time not only fail to increase the strength of the living beings? On the contrary, it would be the last and most dangerous blow to the world. How could Luo Fan do something like that? As a result, he had used all sorts of methods to protect the bodies of all living beings in the past 300 years, protecting their lives. Therefore, even though 300 years had passed, not a single living being had been harmed, let alone killed. On this day, Luo Fan ended his preaching and said, "This time, the preaching will end here. When you go back, you must cultivate well to deal with the upcoming tribulations." With that, he waved his hand without waiting for the living beings to react. The countless cultivators in the starry sky were enveloped by an indescribable force at the same time. With a slight tremble, they were all sent out of this part of the world. They fell from the sky like meteorites. They ruthlessly smashed into their bodies. As the living beings' souls returned to their bodies, the huge stone tablet that appeared out of thin air over 300 years ago began to shake slightly. Immediately after, countless cracks appeared on the stone tablet from top to bottom, left to right, front to back, and back to front. It was as if the stone tablet was shattering from the inside out. Then, under the incredulous gazes of the living beings that had just woken up, the stone tablet suddenly collapsed and turned into countless fragments that flew in all directions. However, after the countless fragments flew in all directions, they did not fall to the ground. Instead, they gradually turned into light spots and gradually merged with the void. Not long after, all the stone tablets on the many continents had completely disappeared, as if they had never been there in the first place. After that, many cultivators suddenly felt that the vitality around them had undergone some sort of subtle change. Originally, the vital energy treated the cultivators equally and did not give them any special treatment. They had to spend a lot of effort and energy to absorb a bit of it into their bodies and turn it into their own power. But it was different now. The vital energy seemed to have suddenly found a master and began to actively enter the cultivators' bodies from all directions. It rapidly turned into power in their bodies and began to push their cultivation realm up. At that moment, everyone understood that this was the ultimate grace that the peerless Almighty was giving them. At that moment, everyone was indescribably touched. They could not help but look at the sky and kneel. Some emotional ones even had tears streaming down their faces. They could not stop kowtowing. After kowtowing, they did not dare to waste the opportunity. They sat on the ground with their legs crossed and closed their eyes. They began to reorganize their cultivation base and their power. They worked hard to integrate what they had learned over the past 300 years into their own bodies and turn it into their own powerful strength. Luo Fan, who was at the center of the world group, did not feel anything when he saw this. After all, he hadn't done all of this for the sake of obtaining the gratitude of all living beings in the world, but for the sake of improving the strength of all living beings so that this world would be able to overcome the third tribulation of the world in a better state. Since that was his goal, what did it matter to him how grateful and how they kowtowed to him? In the following period of time, the world showed an unprecedented peace since its birth. After all, as the source of the unrest, almost all the cultivators were in a state of closed-door cultivation. How would they have the time and energy to create all sorts of unrest? This peace lasted for 1,000 years before it was gradually broken. More and more cultivators improved their strength greatly after 1,000 years of closed-door cultivation. They finally had the energy to compete and fight again. Because of this, the primordial world once again fell into a state of absolute unrest. Disputes arose everywhere, and massacres could be seen everywhere. Luo Fan did not care about these changes at all. He only paid attention to the changes in the cultivation base of the living beings in the void and the changes in the entire primordial world. The peace that lasted for 1,000 years caused the dense murderous aura that had accumulated in the world to become extremely calm. It was as if it had turned into a calm ocean. This could be said to be an unexpected gain after he had preached for 300 years. After the living beings gradually left their closed-door cultivation, the originally calm murderous aura began to stir and gradually returned to its original state of turbulence. Due to the increase in the cultivation of the living beings, the murderous aura produced by the battles and killings was even denser than before. In the end, it caused the sea of murderous aura to become even more explosive, causing the accumulated murderous aura to become even more terrifying. This sort of situation faintly sped up the descent of the third great calamity. Fortunately, the third great tribulation of the heavens and earth, which originally took hundreds of millions of years to accelerate to 3 million years, was already considered to have accelerated to its limit. The acceleration caused by the increase in the baleful aura was insignificant in comparison, so it did not show up too obviously in the time it took for the tribulation to descend. On this day, Luo Fan's heart jolted and he turned his gaze towards Hongjun, who was in a certain world. Faint lightning constantly surged around Hongjun's body, constantly attacking him. It even drilled into his body and started to destroy him from the inside out. Although this situation was a little different from before, it was still a sign of breaking through the mortal realm and stepping into the immortal realm. It's been more than 1,300 years. He's finally willing to make a breakthrough. This thought flashed through his mind, but he did not have any intention of helping Hongjun. Even if he did not take into account the fact that he was originally a Dao ancestor, just the fact that he was Luo Fan's eldest disciple, it was impossible for him to not be able to pass the tribulation of becoming an itinerant immortal. Even if the itinerant immortal tribulation that Hongjun encountered this time was a little special and different from the itinerant immortal tribulation that he had encountered before, it was still the same. The development of the situation confirmed his expectations. Hongjun didn't move at all in the face of the thunderbolt that wrapped around his body. Even his power didn't change. He was as steady as a mountain, allowing the thunderbolt to attack and destroy both inside and outside of his body. Chapter 1947. In the end, Hongjun did not move at all. He allowed the countless lightning bolts to affect his body and forcefully endured the tribulation. In the end, he surpassed the limits of mortals and became an itinerant immortal again. At this moment, the aura he exuded was at least 10,000 times stronger than when he was an itinerant immortal. Moreover, there was a special quality in his aura that he did not have before. It was a quality that was completely different from the entire primordial world, different from Luo Fan, and even different from all the other cultivators that Luo Fan had encountered. It was a quality that completely belonged to Hongjun. When he sensed such a characteristic, Luo Fan's heart suddenly moved. He understood that Hongjun had already entered the door of sorting out his own worldview, as expected of the original Tao ancestor. In such a short period of time, and with the slowest path, he has actually already reached the beginner level. This thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind. As Hongjun, who was originally only a step away from breaking into the Sage-to-Be realm, the itinerant immortal realm was obviously not his ultimate goal. Therefore, after passing this immortal ascension tribulation, Hongjun began to cultivate in seclusion as if nothing had happened. He tried his best to regain his cultivation realm for a moment. The feeling of floating in the air after passing the tribulation gradually faded away. Not long after, he had returned to his ordinary appearance once again. At a glance, Luo Fan could see that in Hong Jun's body, the Dharma power was flowing, constantly absorbing the primordial qi of the outside world, and constantly advancing the essence of his life, trying hard to make his life essence rise. Seeing this scene, Luo Fan only nodded lightly, then dispersed the attention that was gathered around Hong Jun. Time passed slowly. Millions of years passed in a flash. Unknowingly, it was already the time for the third tribulation of the primordial world to descend. After millions of years of development, the cultivation world of the entire primordial world had already undergone earth-shattering changes. Back then, Luo Fan had only used 300 years to preach the Tao. However, the essence of cultivation contained within it was enough for any cultivator to spend billions of years to comprehend it. Under such circumstances, over the past millions of years, almost every cultivator who went to the place where Luo Fan preached to listen to the Tao, no matter what doubts they had, no matter how much progress they made, they could still absorb endless nourishment from what Luo Fan had taught them, and they could follow the smoothest and most correct path to the peak of cultivation. In this way, millions of years had passed, and the level of the cultivators in the primordial world was no longer the same as before. Nowadays, there were too many demi-saints to count. In fact, there were already quite a number of pseudo-saints. As for the Khanate Grand Luo below, there were so many of them that people suspected that there were more of them than dogs. This power was more than 10 million times stronger than before. Such a powerful world of cultivators. This made Luo Fan suspect that even without him, this world would be able to survive the third great tribulation of the world. Of course, this was obviously just an illusion, given the situation where the third tribulation could make him feel that he would be in great trouble if he was not careful. How could it be passed so easily? After all, the tribulation of the world was aimed at the entire world. Therefore, the cultivators who were more sensitive to the world could sense that such a powerful tribulation was about to descend. However, compared to Luo Fan, they did not know the exact source of the tribulation, nor did they know how terrifying it would be. However, that did not stop them from making various responses. Although the conflicts in the primordial world became more and more tragic because the cultivators' cultivation levels increased too quickly. This made the results of the conflicts worse. However, the increase of the cultivators' cultivation realm. In the end, there were still many positive effects. For example, there was already a sect association similar to the Righteous Tao Alliance in the entire world. The sect association took the righteous Tao of the world as its own responsibility. Naturally, it was the first to react to the impending tribulation. It began to integrate the power of the world to resist the terrifying tribulation that was about to arrive. As an alliance of sects that had developed for millions of years, their foundation was enough for them to mobilize most of the power in this world. It was enough to form an extremely vast wave of cultivators that gathered on the continent at the center of the world and began to make all sorts of preparations. The continent in the middle was none other than the location of the Buzhou Mountain. The Buzhou Mountain was the pillar of the world. It had an extremely important position in the primordial world. Currently, although the Buzhou Mountain had already collapsed during the previous tribulation, the remaining mountains still had endless mysteries and had an extremely special position in the world. Thus, the continent fragment where the Buzhou Mountain was located was regarded as the central continent by all living beings in the world, and became the orthodox of the primordial world. The headquarters of the Righteous Tao Alliance was set up on the central continent. Now, they were using the central continent as the main body to deal with the great tribulation of heaven and earth. Luo Fan, on the other hand, was happy to see all these developments. He felt closer to the primordial world than to any other perfect world. Even the Earth universe that he was born in his previous life was inferior to the primordial world. This was not because he had forgotten his roots, nor was it because he measured the degree of closeness by the time he had spent with it. It was because the true foundation of what he was today came from the primordial world. Although he was born in the Earth universe, what truly made him who he was now was this perfect world. Under such circumstances, how could he not feel closer to the primordial world? As for this closeness that surpassed the Earth universe, there was no need to mention it. The Earth universe that he was born in was a universe that would definitely disappear in the future. Although he did not know the specific plan of the 7 great true sages of the Earth universe, he understood that the Earth universe would definitely not shatter into countless fragments. This was definitely not the ultimate goal of the true sages. Since that was the case, no matter what plan they had, in the end they would definitely reverse the reincarnation of the Earth universe. And this, obviously, it would definitely make the future that he was born in disappear. Under such circumstances, the current Earth universe, to him, the difference between a completely unfamiliar and perfect world was not as big as he had imagined. With such a comparison, it was natural that his closeness to the primordial world surpassed that of the Earth universe. Because of his extreme closeness to the primordial world, he was naturally more willing to see the growth of the primordial world. Tempering the cultivators of this world and making them more powerful was clearly something that was beneficial to the growth of this world. Therefore, he did not plan to help the world survive the 3rd great tribulation of heaven and earth. Instead, he planned to quietly watch how the living beings would deal with it. Only when the living beings had no other choice would he really help. Although the cultivators of this generation had already made absolute preparations for the great tribulation of heaven and earth that they had never encountered before, in Luo Fan's opinion, those preparations were clearly far from enough. For example, they set up layers of array formations and began to gather the power of many continents in various parts of the world. They unified the powerful power of the entire world to fight against a certain powerful external enemy that was about to arrive. If these methods were really used to deal with the invasion of other worlds, the effects would naturally be quite obvious. However, it was obviously not suitable to deal with the terrifying Great Tribulation that targeted the world. Although he wanted to train many cultivators, he did not want to watch them be tortured to death. Therefore, seeing that they were in the wrong direction, Luo Fan finally could not sit back and watch anymore. With a slight thought, he summoned the strongest expert of the righteous Tao Alliance. The strongest expert was originally listening to the various reports of his subordinates when he suddenly felt an extremely terrifying power envelop him. Then, before he could react, the incomparably terrifying power had already suppressed everything about him with a slight tremble. With a gentle pull, it pulled him into a boundless starry sky. He was a 3rd stage pseudo-saint. In the primordial world, he was already considered the strongest expert. Its own power was already extremely strong. Normally speaking, any major chiliocosm was just a slightly harder egg in front of him. As long as he was willing, he could easily shatter it. Although the boundless starry sky in front of him looked vast and boundless, it was only slightly troublesome. However, the moment he stepped into the boundless starry sky, he no longer had any thoughts of resisting. He directly knelt on the flat ground under his feet and kowtowed to the sky. He said, "Greetings, Tao Ancestor. May the Tao Ancestor live forever." However, he instantly recognized that this starry sky was the starry sky that all living beings had entered to listen to the Tao that was extremely important to all cultivators in the entire primordial world. Coupled with the powerful power that was enough to make him feel despair, how could he not understand who had summoned him over? Luo Fan was faintly discernible, and his figure appeared in front of him. He did not help him up and only said calmly, "This time, the tribulation is the tribulation of the world. You are dealing with it in the wrong direction." After saying that, he pointed with his hand. The various changes of the previous 2 tribulations turned into information and entered the cultivator's heart. They began to appear again and again. As the information was revealed, the living being could not help but break out in cold sweat. His body could not help but tremble slightly. This tribulation. Even his voice began to tremble. When Luo Fan helped the world survive the two great tribulations of the world, his cultivation realm was hundreds of millions of times weaker than the current living being. However, due to various fortuitous encounters and the special authority he had in this world, he was able to easily mobilize the power of the entire world, allowing him to unleash power that was countless times more powerful than what the current cultivator was capable of. Even then, the world had paid a boundless price, and it was even to the extent that all living beings had been annihilated in order to barely survive those two tribulations. The terror of this tribulation was self-evident. After all, this cultivator was a pseudo-sage cultivator, so his insight was self-evident. He instantly knew that even the previous tribulation was close to his limit. If this tribulation was even more terrifying than the previous two tribulations, then it was definitely beyond what he could handle. Just as he was about to speak, Luo Fan had already casually flicked his hand and directly sent him out of this shadowless expanse of the starry sky. He returned to the palace where he was originally at. "Tao Ancestor! Tao Father!" The cultivator cried out in panic. The cultivator who reported to him stared at him in shock. He didn't know how the Alliance Master became like this after disappearing for a short while. However, to be able to reach the upper echelons of the Righteous Path Alliance, it was not easy. His intelligence wasn't weak, so he quickly realized what was going on. For a moment, he was both envious and surprised. "Alliance Master, did the Tao Ancestor summon you just now?" How could the cultivator still have the mood to answer this kind of question? At this moment, he just began to cry out in panic. "How should I deal with such a great tribulation? Please tell me, Tao Ancestor. I can't hold on any more." As he spoke, he left his seat, looked up at the sky, and kept kowtowing. The cultivator who reported to him didn't know what was going on. But seeing the Alliance Master kneel down and kowtow, he naturally couldn't stand aside and watch. He immediately knelt down and kowtowed as well. Obviously, this kind of kowtow would not get an answer. After a long time, the Alliance Master finally understood that doing this would not have any effect. It was impossible for the Tao Ancestor to respond to his request. For a moment, as if he had lost his parents, he knelt there in a daze. No one knew what he was thinking. After a long time, he reluctantly cheered up. He thought, "It seems that the Tao Ancestor must want to test us. We must deal with this great tribulation well," he thought. He stood up and said to the cultivator who had been kowtowing for a long time in a daze, "Go and invite all the higher-ups here. I have something to say." As he said this, the cultivator nodded blankly and hurried out. In just a few breaths of time, rays of light arrived from all over the place and landed in front of the palace. They stepped into the palace with confused and doubtful expressions. When they stepped into the palace, each and every one of their expressions changed drastically, because they saw that the Alliance Master, who had always been unfathomable, was now in an extremely sorry state. His clothes looked rather messy. His hair was messy and his forehead was bleeding. This appearance, it almost completely subverted their understanding of the original Alliance Master. The Alliance Master didn't say much. With a point of his finger, he released the memory he had obtained from Luo Fan and played it directly in the air above the palace. At first, the higher-ups were extremely puzzled. They didn't know why the Alliance Master would suddenly play the scene of the beginning of the world. However, when the first tribulation unfolded, the earth-shattering massacre and the upheaval of the world instantly caused their expressions to change. None of them dared to believe what they were seeing. After the first tribulation, the world returned to peace. At this point, the cultivators finally heaved a sigh of relief. Although this tribulation was terrifying, for the current them, they could still get through it if they worked hard, but soon, their expressions completely changed. The scene continued to develop and evolve. Soon, the second great tribulation of heaven and earth arrived. The scene of heaven and earth collapsing caused everyone's faces to turn pale. This tribulation was more than 100 times stronger than the last one. Even if they gathered the power of most of the cultivators in this world, they would probably have to pay the price of 80% of the cultivators dying to get through it. As higher-ups, the spiritual wisdom of these cultivators was already at the top among the cultivators. Which one of them was stupid? Soon, the higher-ups connected this tribulation with the two tribulations that had been played. They started to break out in a cold sweat. Alliance Master, where did these come from? One of the upper echelons asked, trembling with fear. They were bestowed by the Tao Ancestor. The Alliance Master's facial muscles twitched slightly. Hearing this, all the higher-ups were in an uproar. All kinds of doubts, shock, and questions came out of the higher-ups' mouths. They mixed together and almost overturned the entire palace. The Alliance Master's expression was rather ugly. He just stood there quietly and watched everyone lose their composure. After a long while, the scene gradually calmed down. Don't think about anything else. This is a test given to us by the Tao Ancestor. We can only rely on ourselves to get through this even more terrifying third tribulation. The Alliance Master said. Hearing this, everyone's expression changed. The previous second tribulation was enough to make them feel despair. Now, they had to get through this even more terrifying third tribulation alone. This was like a huge hammer constantly hammering at their hearts. However, they were all cultivators after all, so they didn't hysterically say that it was impossible. They also didn't immediately ask the Alliance leader to tell them how he came to this conclusion. Looking at the Alliance leader's sorry state, it was obvious how he came to this conclusion. At that moment, they began to think and wisely discuss how to deal with it. The result of the discussion was soon out. The way the alliance of the righteous sects united the cultivators also began to change. The way they gathered the power of all living beings also began to change. Originally, they were only dealing with external enemies. Now, they were helping this world to strengthen itself and help this world resist all changes that could disintegrate it. Chapter 1948. As the living beings of the untainted land panicked and prepared, the third great tribulation of the untainted land arrived unexpectedly. The best reading experience is here. At this moment, the sky was filled with chaotic colors. All kinds of indescribable pressure descended from the sky and appeared in the hearts of all living beings, making them feel the terror of the end of the world. At this moment, the cultivators of the Alliance of the Righteous Tao sensed the tribulation more intuitively and keenly than other living beings. What appeared in their eyes was the scene of the end of the world, similar to the previous two great tribulations of the world. In the face of this change, their preparations started quickly. Boundless light shot into the sky from the various continents, making them look like pieces of diamonds that began to shine brightly. As the rays of light shone, an indescribable sense of stability appeared in the hearts of all living beings on the continents, dispelling the indescribable panic brought about by the gray, chaotic sky. That caused them to feel all sorts of optimism towards the upcoming tribulation. Only the cultivators of the Alliance of the Righteous Tao knew that just activating this protection had already made them feel an indescribable pressure. All the preparations they had made over the years were rapidly being consumed at a visible rate. Just the omen alone had already caused such an outcome. How could they not be worried about how terrifying the final tribulation would be when it truly erupted with wisdom? Tao Ancestor, I hope our performance won't disappoint you. The Alliance Master hovered at the highest point of the central continent and looked up at the sky as such thoughts flashed through his mind. At this moment, an earth-shattering thunderclap suddenly came from the sky. A huge thunderclap abruptly burrowed out of the sky, clenching a huge fist the size of a continent, and slammed it down on the ground. The thunderclap that formed the huge hand was not ordinary thunderclap, but a type of chaotic thunderclap. It was a type of chaotic thunderclap. Compared to the tribulation that the strongest cultivators could trigger when they became itinerant immortals, it was countless times more powerful. Even a connate zenith heaven cultivator would have to gather all the strength in his body to barely resist it. It was not hard to imagine how terrifying the thunderclap was when it formed such a huge hand to attack. It was not hard to imagine how terrifying it would be if such thunderbolts were to form such a huge hand to attack. Just the lightning that formed the giant hand alone was enough to scorch the void. It caused countless black cracks to appear in the void, wrapping around the huge hand. It was like the countless lush hairs on the huge hand, constantly drifting and spreading in the void. The area became wider and wider, and it continued to wreak havoc in the untainted land. However, the material of these thunderbolts was clearly not the strongest aspect of this attack. In fact, it was the strongest attack of all. It was the image of the lightning. That hand was not the hand of an ordinary living being or cultivator. Instead, it was filled with boundless profundities. Even the slightest curve, the slightest undulation, contained boundless profundities, and contained boundless principles. Not to mention anything else, just the palm lines on the palm of that huge hand were extremely terrifying. All of them were condensed from the boundless heavens and the earth. They were densely packed, piled up, and pushed against each other to give birth to all the phenomena of the mortal world, the movement of his lower body. At first glance, it seemed to be bombarding the ground from the sky without any technique. However, in reality, the huge hand displayed billions of changes in every instant. In an absolute way, it mobilized all the power it could touch and all the rules and laws it could activate. They turned into support for the powerful attack of the fist, causing the rules and laws of the world to continuously collapse as the fist continued to bombard the world. It even caused the supreme great Tao to be stirred crazily as if a hand had reached into it, creating all sorts of almost uncontrollable chaos. Although the alliance of the righteous sects had already gathered the power of many cultivators to resist this great tribulation, their knowledge was limited. However, there was a limit to their knowledge. Even if Luo Fan had already shown them the scenes of the previous two great tribulations, they had not experienced it themselves. After all, they were unable to truly understand how terrifying the great tribulation of the heavens and earth was. In the face of this sudden crisis, they were at a loss for what to do and did not know how to resist. Faced with this situation, Luo Fan, who was watching everything from the World Group, sighed. After all, there was too little time, and the quality of these cultivators was still somewhat lacking. If they had 10 times the time to accumulate and prepare, even if they could not easily destroy this wave of tribulations, they would definitely not be in such a sorry state. They were at a loss and did not know how to react. However, he did not make a move right away. Although the many cultivators were at a loss, it was clearly only temporary. However, he knew that no matter how bad their performance was, they could still resist this attack, even if they had to pay a huge price. Since the many cultivators could resist this attack, he naturally did not need to make a move. As expected, just as this thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind, the leader of the Alliance of the Righteous Sects finally reacted. He roared, "How can we fail at this time?" With this roar, his power was quickly transmitted through a magic treasure that he had refined over the years to the various nodes of the Alliance of the Righteous Sects deployment throughout the untainted land. He directly mobilized the power of the various deployments and produced an earth-shattering combined force. Suddenly, countless fine silk nets were formed in the void. They constantly combined and connected. In an instant, they had already formed a boundless barrier in front of the huge fist. After all, the alliance of the righteous sects was only an alliance. No matter how strong they were, they could not control all the cultivators and all the regions in this world. As a result, it was naturally impossible for their arrangements to cover every inch of space in the world. It was impossible for them to perfectly protect the entire world. As a result, there seemed to be countless holes in the huge silk net this time around, These holes were even several times larger than the original huge silk net itself. Under such circumstances, when the huge fist landed on the silk net, the terrifying impact naturally slanted and poured down through the holes. It brazenly crashed into the endless ocean of the untainted land and into the land that was not under the protection of the alliance of the righteous sex. This, of course, was an oversight. However, it coincidentally formed a kind of unloading force, causing the silk net, which was originally relatively powerless against the thunderous fist, to actually hold on for a longer time. In the end, it barely held on until the power of the numerous fists was released through the holes. Only less than a 10,000th of the power was left, and it blasted into the area under the protection of the silk net. For a moment, the entire untainted land began to shake violently. At this moment, countless cracks appeared in the supreme great way. The rules and principles seemed to be stirred up by a huge hand. It began to transform into a mess. It seemed that in just a short moment, the untainted land had already fallen into the end of the world. Even the supreme great way and the rules and principles had already suffered such great damage, so the damage to the spacetime on the surface would only be greater, not lesser. For a moment the earth cracked, the mountains and seas turned into nothingness, and all living beings perished. Endless murderous aura and endless resentment surged into the sky. It soared into the sky and almost covered the entire sky of the untainted land in a blood-red color. In just such a short period of time, nearly 1/10 of the entire untainted land had been destroyed. And the number of living beings that died had directly exceeded 1,000,000,000,000. It had almost reached 1/5 of the entire untainted land. This was enough to make any cultivator who sensed all of this have their eyes turned red and their hearts filled with boundless anger. The Alliance Master of the Alliance of the Righteous Sex and the other higher-ups were obviously such cultivators who could sense all of this. At this moment, as the entire untainted land shook violently, their eyes had already turned red. Their chi and blood swelled to the point that their bodies almost exploded, and even their rationality was almost burned away by anger. In this situation where they were gradually losing their rationality, even though they knew that the Tao ancestor must have his intentions, they could not help but feel resentful towards the Tao ancestor. If the Tao ancestor was willing to help, things would not have turned out this way. Under this kind of resentment, many cultivators gradually lost control of their hearts, and their minds were invaded by the inexplicable murderous aura. Unknowingly, their eyes turned red. The rationality in their hearts was finally completely broken, and they began to attack their companions around them. This sudden change suddenly made the Alliance Master, who was gradually losing his rationality, suddenly sober up. Oh no, this is the murderous aura of the tribulation that is stirring up our emotions. Similar situations occurred in the last 2 tribulations. With this thought, he forcibly suppressed all kinds of resentment and all kinds of negative emotions in his heart, and shouted, "Open the heart-calming array! Resist the murderous aura of the tribulation!" This shout was transmitted through the magic treasure in his hand to all the nodes of the entire untainted land, so that all the remaining rational cultivators suddenly reacted. In an instant, rays of clear light shot up from the many remnants of the continents and began to combine with the scattered light from before, producing an indescribable heavenly sound that gradually entered the ears of all living beings and entered their minds, causing them to gradually wake up from the indescribable negative emotions. The cultivators who had just killed their companions realized what they had just done, and could not help but burst into tears. The pain in their hearts almost completely ignited them. All of this is the influence of the tribulation. What we need to do is to break this tribulation, so that we can be worthy of our dead companions. The Alliance Master shouted at this moment. In fact, most of the people who had really started to kill their companions were the higher-ups of the Alliance of the Orthodox Sex. This was because only these higher-ups knew that Luo Fan had warned them, and they also knew that the reason such a huge loss had occurred so quickly was because Luo Fan had not done anything. Therefore, they had such strong negative emotions in their hearts, and that was why the murderous aura of the tribulation had seized the opportunity and caused such a huge mistake. It was precisely because of their status that the Alliance Master had specially given advice to this situation. If they were just ordinary cultivators, the Alliance Master had so many things to do, how could he have had time to care about them? Although the untainted land had suffered such great damage, this was only the beginning of the tribulation, after all. The essence of this part of the world had still not suffered much damage. Its ability to recover was still extremely strong. Therefore, although this part of the world seemed to have been pushed into a state of doomsday, it very quickly struggled again, and the supreme Great Tao was once again broken. The chaos of the nomological laws was quickly smoothed out. As for the destroyed continents and the destroyed living beings, there was no way for them to come back. It was not that this part of the world could not do it, but at this time there was no way to do it. In the sky, at this moment, a gigantic figure formed by lightning gradually pressed down from the sky, bit by bit. This figure looked like the primordial world's connate Taoism body. Its size was definitely on the same level as the entire untainted land. In terms of proportion, the huge lightning fist that had previously broken through the sky. The huge lightning fist that had caused the untainted land to lose 1/5 of the living beings and 1/10 of the region was this giant's fist. Seeing this scene, the eyes of the Alliance Master of the Righteous Tao Alliance revealed a strong determination. He began to loudly issue orders to all the nodes of the world, gathering all the power he had prepared, and began to turn into infinite sharp blades that shot up into the sky. They quickly merged in the void and evolved rapidly. They continued to rise, and finally reached an unimaginable level. Like a huge light blade that spanned the heavens and the earth, it directly blasted towards the head of the huge figure. This terrifying attack formed by all the power was incomparably huge, and in the eyes of all living beings, it was even as indomitable as Buzhou Mountain. However, compared to the giant, it was still extremely narrow. It even felt like it was as narrow as a needle. As such an attack rushed towards the giant, it was like a needle rushing straight towards someone. Such a comparison was enough to make people feel discouraged. In fact, this was somewhat out of everyone's expectations. This time, the attack brazenly penetrated time and space, pierced through the sky, and directly pierced between the eyebrows of the huge creature. In the blink of an eye, it had already disappeared. Immediately after, the giant's body became sluggish, and a series of incomparably loud explosions came from its head. The giant's head exploded with a loud bang. Waves of incomparably powerful shockwaves spread out from the explosion. It continuously blasted into the untainted land, shaking the entire time and space of the entire untainted land, as well as the higher nomological laws and supreme Great Tao. At this time, even the creatures with the slowest senses could sense that the entire untainted land had been greatly damaged by this impact. It was even possible that the entire untainted land would be completely destroyed by this impact in the next moment. It's working! Even though the order to attack was issued by the Alliance Master himself, he still felt incredulous when he saw the effect of this attack with his own eyes. After all, the giant was really too huge, and the performance of the previous punch was too powerful. All of their confidence had already been destroyed in that instant. That attack from before could be considered as their final resistance in the face of despair. Under such a background, the effect of this attack was actually able to easily shatter the giant's head. Although the impact caused by this attack was a little too big, it was enough to make them inexplicably surprised. Just as everyone was secretly rejoicing, the entire giant suddenly collapsed, turning into a huge ball of chaotic lightning that constantly surged outside the world. Lightning constantly burst out, breaking through the barrier of untainted land like rain, and poured down towards untainted land in an overwhelming manner. Oh no! The Alliance Master's expression changed drastically. After dispersing, The attack was much weaker than the direct attack of the giant, but the number was countless times greater. Such a change made the difficulty of intercepting the attack countless times higher than before. Although the impact it would cause wouldn't be as violent as before, it would definitely not be any less if it were to accumulate. Moreover, it was almost impossible to completely block this attack. This time, without waiting for the Alliance Master to give the order, all the nodes had already begun to move. Those attacks were coming at their heads. If they did not move, they would die. How dare they not move? For a time, long rainbows soared into the sky and rushed towards the lightning. The lightning itself could condense into such a great giant, so there was naturally no need to say much about its mysteriousness. After every bolt of lightning came into contact with the primordial world, it began to transform in the void. It turned into various powerful living beings that had the original form of the primordial world, but they were fundamentally different from it. They pounced towards the ground. Under such circumstances, the cultivators of the various nodes came into contact with the creatures formed by the lightning. An extremely tragic war broke out. Although the creatures formed by the lightning were countless times weaker than their original forms, there was no doubt that they were powerful. Even the weakest of them had the strength of an itinerant immortal. Some of the stronger ones even had the cultivation of a pseudo-sage. Such creatures were densely packed, covering the sky and covering the earth. To the many cultivators, it was as tragic as fighting against an army that was several times stronger than them. Chapter 1949. At the center of the world group, Luo Fan did not pay attention to the countless chaotic thunderbolts that had fallen into the primordial world. Instead, his gaze was focused on the chaotic thunderbolt cloud that had almost covered the entire primordial world outside the primordial world. The chaotic thunderbolts that had fallen into the primordial world seemed extremely dangerous and could cause great harm to all living beings in the world. However, in Luo Fan's eyes, the creatures formed by the thunderbolts were actually nothing. With the current power of the primordial world, it also had the ability to resist them. Comparatively speaking, the enormous primal chaos lightning cloud was the most difficult to deal with. It must be known that the thunderbolt energy contained in the chaotic thunderbolt cloud was more than 1,000,000,000,000 times stronger than the endless thunderbolts that had fallen into the primordial world. At this moment, the thunderbolts that were billions of times stronger than the endless thunderbolts were still continuously gathering, wanting to evolve into something with obvious malice. It was clearly not something that the current power of the primordial world could resist. In other words, it was time for him to make a move. With a thought, the spiritual treasure embryo formed by the innate indestructible spiritual light began to emerge from his body. It slowly rotated in front of him, and gradually gave off a mysterious and wondrous aura. It penetrated the void between the world group and the entire world group. It began to spread across the entire primordial world, and in the end it headed straight for the thunderbolt cloud in the sky. Since the thunderbolt cloud could be seen in the primordial world with a glance, it was clearly between entering and not entering. Under such circumstances, with Luo Fan's ability, it would not be a problem for him to reach that position. Not to mention that he wanted to use the power of the spiritual treasure embryo to do this. In the blink of an eye, the lightning cloud came into contact with the mysterious aura. In an instant, it triggered an incomparably intense reaction, and specks of strange colors appeared. Specks of strange colors appeared on the thunderbolt cloud. Countless worlds and spacetime were born from the point of contact, and in an instant, they completely collapsed. As a result, the chaotic lightning cloud suffered a huge impact. Even the process of gathering seemed to have been greatly affected. At this moment, it suddenly became a little sluggish. At this moment, an incomparably terrifying aura began to surge upwards through the boundless aura released by Luo Fan's spirit treasure embryo. It was heading straight for Luo Fan. This aura transcended time and space. The instant it was born, it had already surpassed the limit and crashed into the spirit treasure embryo, causing the ring of light around the spirit treasure embryo to violently tremble, as if it was about to collapse. At the same time, Luo Fan felt that the very essence of his existence had received a huge impact. As his body trembled, countless violent explosions occurred, and the powerful impact directly tore his body apart. It caused its body to shatter into countless pieces, as if it had suddenly turned into smoke. Fortunately, although the impact was strong, it was only an impact in the end. It did not involve the concept at all. To Luo Fan, who had condensed the concept of existence into the world of laws, the damage of his body being shattered was as normal as a scratch on his skin with a thought. His body reformed, and it looked exactly the same as before. It was as if the impact from before had never happened. At this moment, Luo Fan had already probed some of the characteristics of the chaotic thunderbolt cloud. Without hesitation, he used his mind to activate the spirit treasure embryo. A strong light was released from the spirit treasure embryo. In an instant, it penetrated endless spacetime and obstacles, directly arriving at the place where the thunderbolt cloud was, and collided with it. For a moment, the thunderbolt cloud began to surge violently. Countless worlds were born and condensed. They turned into countless living beings that were tens of thousands of times stronger than the living beings formed by the thunderbolts that had been thrown into the primordial world. They were at least at the connate zenith heaven realm, and some of them had even reached the false sage level. They directly entangled with the light emitted by the spirit treasure embryo. The light emitted by the spirit treasure embryo contained boundless power and an indescribable terror. Just like that, the living beings formed by the chaotic thunderbolt cloud entangled with it. The battle between them was so intense that it exceeded the imagination of all living beings. The chaotic thunderbolt cloud was extremely large in number, and any one of them was enough to turn into a terrifying attack that would make cultivators despair. The light emitted by Luo Fan's spirit treasure embryo was endless, and it had everything. Under such circumstances, the battle between them was full of momentum. Neither side could easily suppress the other, and it continued like this. Along with this change, the gathering of the primal chaos lightning cloud naturally slowed down. Obviously, it had already been slowed down by the light emitted by the spirit treasure embryo, and this had obviously achieved the initial goal that Luo Fan wanted. Besides wanting to weaken the energy of the chaotic lightning cloud, he'd also sent out the light to delay its evolution. After all, no matter what the chaotic thunderbolt cloud wanted to evolve, with its current position, it would definitely be extremely disadvantageous to the primordial world. Time continued, and in the blink of an eye, several years had passed. Over the past few years, Luo Fan had endlessly activated the power of the spiritual treasure embryo, sending endless rays of light into the primal chaos lightning cloud. The terrifying attacks from the primal chaos lightning cloud had caused an incomparably intense battle. Both sides were constantly being consumed, but at the same time, they were constantly being replenished. It was like a tug-of-war. Currently, the chaotic thunderbolt cloud was almost completely covered by this kind of battlefield. Looking up from any part of the primordial world, the originally terrifying chaotic lightning cloud had been completely replaced by the endless world and the endless battlefield. When they looked over, they could only see endless and tragic battles. As for the gathering of the chaotic thunderbolt cloud, it had already stopped at some point in time. As for the interior of the primordial world, in the past few years, it was like being in the most tragic hell. There were battlefields and killings everywhere. Although the creatures evolved from the chaotic thunderbolt were extremely powerful, under the accumulation of the sea of creatures in the primordial world, they were gradually destroyed. The entire primordial world gradually recovered its clarity and order. Of course, on the other hand, the primordial world had also paid an incomparably huge price. In just a few years, the number of cultivators in the entire world had decreased to less than a tenth. As for the alliance of the righteous Tao, which bore the brunt of the attack, there was less than 1/100th of the members left. The calamity hasn't passed yet, but we've done our best." The leader of the Alliance of the Righteous Alliance muttered as he floated above the central continent in an extremely miserable manner. He raised his head and looked at the endless battlefield above the primal chaos thunderclouds. At this moment, his strength was already less than a millionth of his original strength. Originally, he was a third-stage pseudo-sage, but now, he could barely maintain his quasi-sage, although his body didn't seem to have suffered many injuries. If one were to calculate it, almost every part of his body had been completely shattered. If it were not for his high cultivation realm and his strong ability to control his body and power, he would have died tens of thousands of times. At this moment, he could naturally see that the reason why the chaotic thunderbolt cloud above had not been completely activated in the past few years was because the Tao ancestor was blocking it. Because he understood this, the hatred in his heart for Luo Fan had completely disappeared. Previously, all the cultivators of the entire primordial world had gathered their strength to resist the countless living beings formed from the chaotic thunderbolt for several years. The amount of chaotic thunderbolt contained in the chaotic thunderbolt cloud was countless times more than the amount that had been thrown into the primordial world. All of these were blocked by the Tao ancestor. If this was considered not contributing, then he couldn't think of anything else that could be considered contributing. In the past few years, Luo Fan had been floating in the group of worlds. Compared to a few years ago, he was no longer as relaxed as he used to be. Instead, he sat cross-legged with a solemn expression with his eyes closed. At this moment, he had already integrated all of his attention into the numinous treasure embryo in front of him. He controlled the power of the numinous treasure embryo and stimulated all kinds of mysterious attacks to resist the attack of the chaotic thunderbolt cloud. In the past few years, the situation seemed to be extremely stable, maintaining the advantage of the primordial world. However, only Luo Fan, who was directly facing the chaotic thunderbolt cloud, knew how many changes were being derived from the chaotic thunderbolt cloud at every moment. The endless changes forced him to wholeheartedly resist and control them. Only in this way could he prevent the chaotic thunderbolt cloud from breaking through his attack and complete the gathering process that had been delayed for several years. It could be said that if Luo Fan had been careless, the primordial world would not have been the same as it was today. It would definitely have suffered the powerful attack of the chaotic thunderbolt cloud. Perhaps it would not have been destroyed directly, but it would definitely have been thousands or even tens of thousands of times more damaged than it was now. At a certain moment, Luo Fan's expression suddenly changed. This was because he suddenly felt that a new change had been born in the chaotic thunderbolt cloud. It was a change that had never appeared in the endless changes over the past few years. An indescribable power directly penetrated the barrier of the numinous treasure embryo, penetrated the endless spacetime, and broke through countless barriers. It brazenly descended on the group of worlds where Luo Fan was at. During this process, the light of the numinous treasure embryo, and even the numinous treasure embryo itself, seemed to not exist at all. It could not affect this power at all. In the end, this power directly landed on Luo Fan and began to quickly seep into his soul and the essence of his life. Oh no! Luo Fan was secretly shocked. Although he did not know what this power was, it could penetrate the barrier of the numinous treasure embryo in such a way, penetrate all his defenses, and even penetrate the entire spacetime. It went without saying how dangerous this power was. At this moment, he forcibly condensed his Dharma power of laws and began to frantically block this power. Based on what he thought, given how bizarre that power was, even though his law power possessed boundless might and was capable of endless transformations, it was still impossible for him to completely block that power. At most, it could only block a part of it. However, the development of the situation was out of his expectations. Luo Fan did not use much Dharma power of laws. He only used the Dharma power of laws that was equivalent to the power of the power. That power was actually like an ordinary person running into an iron wall. He directly broke his head and bled. All the power splashed in all directions, and it was actually about to dissipate. Seeing this situation, Luo Fan could not react for a moment. This fragile appearance and the fact that it could completely ignore all the defenses of the numinous treasure embryo were simply two extremes. Even the heaven-defying performance of the numinous treasure embryo was simply two extremes. No matter how rich his imagination was, he could not have imagined that such a thing would happen. However, Luo Fan was Luo Fan after all. He quickly regained his composure. With a thought, he suddenly transformed the Dharma power of laws and formed a strange vortex. It directly produced a powerful suction force and pulled the power that was about to dissipate in all directions. It was constantly sucked into the vortex. As the vortex formed by the Dharma power of laws continuously absorbed and devoured the power, the various characteristics of the power began to appear in his mind. Of course, it was only some of the mysteries on the surface. After all, the power was able to easily penetrate all the defenses of the numinous treasure embryo. Even if it was much weaker in strength, it still contained mysteries that Luo Fan could not understand. Under such circumstances, no matter how strong Luo Fan's magical power was, no matter how abnormal his analytical ability was, it was still impossible for him to completely analyze all the mysteries within it. However, even these mysteries on the surface were enough for Luo Fan to understand why the power was so fragile under his Dharma power of laws. This power. It was none other than the power that appeared when Luo Fan went through the Great Tribulations. It pulled his soul into another plane and another incomparably real world. However, it contained all kinds of changes that did not exist in the real world. In other words, if Luo Fan could not resist this power, then his soul would be separated from his body under the effect of this power. It was like reincarnation, turning into another creature. In another world, in another heaven and earth, he diligently sought transcendence, seeking to return to his own body. If that was the case, then the chaotic thundercloud would no longer be obstructed. With just a few simple and subtle transformations, it would definitely be able to bypass all the attacks and obstructions of the numinous treasure embryo, and the fusion would be successful. This kind of attack was not strong, and it was not direct. It could be said that from the perspective of the chaotic thundercloud, this method was really the most effective one. In fact, the various actions of the chaotic thundercloud over the years might have been to make Luo Fan lose his vigilance and finally create such an opportunity to kill him in one blow. However, Luo Fan was completely different from all the living beings that the chaotic thundercloud understood. He had already gone through the third great tribulation. Because he had gone through the third great tribulation, he activated the fundamental power derived from his world of laws, the Dharma power of laws. This Dharma power of laws seemed ordinary, but it was obtained during the Great Tribulation. It helped him overcome the Great Tribulation and returned safely under the attack of the Great Tribulation. This Dharma power of laws naturally had an unimaginable counter to all powers that were similar to the Great Tribulation. This kind of power was almost the same as the mechanism that would appear in every Great Tribulation and pull his soul to another level. Naturally, it was completely targeted by the Dharma power of laws. That was why the current situation was like this. Although the power was so mysterious and terrifying, it was completely incompatible with Luo Fan's Dharma power of law. That was why it was so fragile. After understanding the nature of this power, Luo Fan suddenly relaxed completely. It seems that using the numinous treasure embryo to resist the chaotic thundercloud isn't the best choice. With this thought in mind, the power of laws completely crushed all the power in the air. Immediately afterward, he poured the Dharma power of laws into the numinous treasure embryo without hesitation. Through the mysterious changes of the numinous treasure embryo, not only did it penetrate endless spacetime and arrived at the chaotic thundercloud without any loss, It even increased in quality and quantity due to the help of the numinous treasure embryo. After appearing in that area, it naturally evolved into billions of realms of laws and crashed into the chaotic thundercloud. At this moment, the chaotic lightning clouds were in an unimaginable chaos. Countless bolts of lightning frantically gathered towards the world of laws and smashed into the world of laws. The violent situation was a world of difference compared to the lukewarm attacks of the spiritual treasure embryonic light before.